Thank you. The Committee on Natural Resources will now come to order. The committee is meeting today to hear testimony in the U.S. Department of Interior's budget and policy priorities for fiscal year 2020. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. Therefore, I will ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the record of this hearing if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. Let me recognize myself. Mr. Secretary, for my opening statements, welcome again, and thank you for the opportunity that we had to personally meet, as you did with other individual members of the committee. It's very much appreciated. I think the need for civility and professionalism in our communications and our interactions is a shared attitude by members and yourself. And I appreciated the conversation. It was necessary and frank, and I respect that. I think, Mr. Secretary, our differences are rooted in a very profound concern that on the direction of the Interior Department, a concern that is shared by the majority on this committee. And that concern and the direction is rooted in the rationale and the motivation behind this direction and the decision-making that's at the Department of Interior. And I might add, and the determination of this committee to exercise its constitutional prerogatives to find out. And with that, let me submit for the record the remainder of the opening statement, the content of my opening statement, so that we can expedite the opportunity for members to interact, ask questions of the Secretary today. With that, if there's no objection, with that, let me turn to and recognize the ranking member, Bishop, for his opening statements. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. We actually need to drag this out so you can get more members here. Today, I'm happy to be here. I want you to know, Mr. Chairman, I have brought my own Dr. Pepper, so this time when you spill coffee on me, I can come back. I have some place to respond. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Very happy to have you here as the 53rd Secretary of the Interior Department. Thank you also for being in Utah for the Golden Spike anniversary, 150th anniversary there. Your words were most profound. I appreciate that. Appreciate you actually being there. That was a significant commemoration of a significant date that changed America. So I appreciate you doing that. I realize that a lot of people in your position have been appointed there for political reasons or to pay off some special interest group. I think you are a different Secretary of Interior. You know what you're talking about. And that is extremely positive. You have been confirmed for 35 days. In those 35 days, we have been in session only 18 of those, and this committee has been doing business for 9 of those 18. So I appreciate you having spent as much time as you have up here in the House. I realize you've already talked to the House appropriators, for which you have our deepest sympathy, and you'll be going to the Senate soon, for which you have a whole lot of empathy going over there. But thank you for being here with us. I also realize that you have been spending your time talking to individual members. I think that's a wise approach to do. That's very unprecedented. That is very cool. I also realize that you've been talking to more Democrats than Republicans, so I'm going to cascade you now, and I said I want equal time and equal treatment. Although, if you look at this committee, there's only 2 of our committee members that are new to it. They need a lot more help. So I appreciate that, but be with us. I think as we started this session and we passed the backlog, or the SB 47, whatever we called that thing, it showed that we can actually be productive in a bipartisan and bicameral manner. And I think as we go forward, there are lots of things in which we want to engage with you and the department to continue that process. There's a backlog issue that needs to be done in a bipartisan and bicameral way. There's a forest fire issue that needs to be done in a bicameral and bipartisan way. And even though you don't have charge of the Forest Service, many of the things that we're talking about here that the Forest Service wants can apply to BLM to mitigate the wildfires in that particular area as well. I appreciate the amount of information that you've sent up here. I want Mr. Grijalva to know that even though he doesn't believe this, I have a great deal of empathy for the situation he is in and some of the frustrations. In the 4 years I was working with Doc Hastings when he was chairman, and my first 2 years as chairman, we had an administration and an interior department that was of a different political party. That was a frustrating situation. I realized I asked for a lot of materials, and we didn't get that. What I'm telling you right now is I think you have been unprecedented in the amount of information that you have been sharing and giving, and I want Mr. Grijalva to know that I understand what it was like in his position with this situation. I do have empathy for that, but I have appreciated the open approach that you have taken in that, and it's going to happen before. Let me just say that what we were getting from a prior administration was not nearly as comprehensive as what you have been sharing with this committee, but I also understand the situation Mr. Grijalva is in. I can appreciate it because I felt the same way at different times. I just think I was more justified in it. With that, I'm happy to have you here. We're going to be talking about this is tentatively to talk about budget issues, even though the Democrats say they're not going to have a budget, but other than that, I'm sure there's going to be a wide variety of questions that are being given to you. Thank you for your willingness in this very short period of time since your confirmation to be up here and to be with us, and I appreciate your efforts so far, and once again, I am very grateful for what you did at Golden Spike. With that, Mr. Chairman, let me yield back, and we can get on with this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bishop, and we're gushing with a lot of empathy today. That's good.
It won't last long. Take it while you get it. Yeah.
I want to thank and thank you. Our witness today is Secretary of the Department of Interior, Mr. David Bernhardt. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be here, and as I stated earlier, for taking the time to meet with individual members as well. That's appreciated. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes. Your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. The lights in front will turn yellow when there's 1 minute left and red when time has expired. After Mr. Bernhardt testifies, members will be given the opportunity to ask questions. And with that, Secretary Bernhardt, you're recognized for your testimony. Thank you.
Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Bishop, and members of the committee, good morning. I do request that my written statement be inserted in the record at the appropriate place. This is my first time appearing before the full committee. I'm appearing at the chairman's request to discuss the department's budget and policy priorities for fiscal year 2020. I began my career 26 years ago in probably the lowest seat on this side of the bench, I believe. Maybe it was the other side of the bench, but it was basically over here. And when I came in here, there was a big picture of Wayne Aspinall, the person who had been chairman between, I think, 1959 and 73. And I thought this was a magnificent room, and it's an honor to be here today. The President's fiscal year 2020 budget was transmitted to Congress on March 11th. On March 27th, the Principal Deputy for Policy Management and Budget, Scott Cameron, appeared before the committee and provided the department's perspective on the budget. In addition, a number of the department's bureaus have testified before their respective subcommittees on both the budget and policy. On April 3rd, Dan Smith, the Deputy Director of the National Park Service, testified on the National Park, Forest, and Public Lands Subcommittee on the Park Service's budget request, and on April 10th, Brian Steed, the Deputy Director of the Bureau of Land Management, testified before that subcommittee on BLM's request. Other subcommittee hearings on Bureau budgets are scheduled in the near future. I think Mr. Huffman has a hearing with Reclamation, maybe tomorrow even. Several of our bureaus have also appeared before Energy and Minerals Subcommittee in early March to discuss departmental policies and priorities under their programs, including on March 6th, Walter Cruikshank, our acting director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and Doug Morris, the chief of Offshore Regulatory Programs for the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, and then Mike Ned, our deputy director of BLM Management, testified on the 12th. In these hearings, the committee has heard and discuss the specific details of the department's FY 2020 submission and the department's Bureau's policy priorities. As part of my written statement, I've included their testimonies so that it can refresh your recollection. The President has been clear in his direction to and priorities for the department. With the overreaching goal of continued economic growth and prosperity, he's expressed his vision to the department through a series of executive orders, which are detailed in my written statement. Those documents have served as a foundation for the department's policy objectives. As Secretary, I will work hard to meet the President's vision and to strike a right balance of protection and sustainable use of resources in a way that will provide conservation stewardship, enhance the safety of our communities, increase energy security, and allow America to prosper. At the same time, I will strive to meet the administration's broader economic objective of managing federal spending with restraint. In terms of my specific areas of focus, we intend to proceed with the department's reorganization, including efforts to relocate some operations out west, closer to where the assets and the acres are located, particularly for the Bureau of Land Management. We are working hard to address workplace harassment across the department. We've established a clear anti-harassment policy, which was unprecedented in the department. We directed each bureau to develop an action plan to address its harassment-related issues, and I'm tracking the progress in their implementing those plans. We launched an internal workplace cultural transformation advisory council to look at common issues raised in the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, ways to improve employee engagement, and we're trying to build career paths that cross bureau silos. We've taken significant action to combat workplace misconduct, but there is more to be done and more that must be done. The department has also grappled for many years to address deteriorating infrastructure across our bureaus and the maintenance backlog in our national parks, national wildlife refuges, the Bureau of Indian Education schools, and even some of our water facilities. Mr. Chairman, as we discussed when we met, I'm committed to working with Congress to develop a legislative solution to address these important infrastructure needs. We've put a proposal in our budget, and I'm sure there's other ways to address it, but I think that is an area we can find some common ground. It is also my hope that we can find some common ground to address range and hazardous fuels management to allow us to minimize the likelihood of catastrophic fire on the lands that we manage. We've proposed some ideas. I know that Representative Huffman has proposed a bill to address some ideas. I don't think these ideas are completely mutually exclusive. I'd like to find some common ground. We've proposed 6 specific provisions in our budget, and I'd like to use them as a point to talk forward and go forward on. With that, I will conclude my testimony and prepare for your questions.
Let me, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Let me recognize myself for an initial question. Mr. Secretary, I think it's important, I'd like to start by addressing one of the big elephants in the room, and that President Trump told the Washington Post last month that he opposes the current and former White House aides and personnel testifying to Congress. He said, quote, "There is no reason to go any further, and especially in a Congress where it's very partisan. The lack of transparency and accountability concerns this committee a great deal. Since the beginning of the year, we've sent 17 documented requests to Interior Department and only got substantive partial responses to 2 of them. I want to be clear that answering congressional inquiries is not a matter of the president's or, for that matter, a secretary's personal discretion. We have legal justification for that kind of request and no legal justification for not responding to those requests. It's also, I think, important to note that the administration's lack of accountability has gone well beyond the Mueller report The White House has gone so far as to ignore legally unambiguous access to the president's tax returns. President Trump has made it clear he's not interested in cooperating with legitimate congressional inquiries of any kind, for that matter. His attitude seems to be, Mr. Secretary, that Democrats are just out to get him, and so his administration is not going to respond to our questions or our concerns. I'm concerned that this stonewalling will escalate to a constitutional collision. From crisis to collision seems to be an inevitability if the attitude continues. If the president continues to ignore legitimate questions, whether it suits him, whenever it suits him, and tells his appointees to do the same, Congress will have the duty to defend and enforce their constitutional rights. Since Secretary Zinke's abrupt departure, your transition from acting secretary to confirmed head of the department, we've been doing our due diligence on this committee to fulfill our oversight responsibility, and in doing so, have made inquiries from subcommittees to full committee. We've been very, and I might add, we've been very judicious about compelling the agency to respond to these questions. But we need to know, I think the committee needs to know, and I pose this question, we need to know what kind of relationship we're going to have with you as an equal branch of government from now on. I'd like to hear from you whether you feel the same way the president does in terms of his attitude toward committee oversight, inquiry, legitimate questions, and legal initiatives to try to acquire and have that information. And can we expect a healthier relationship with the Interior Department? That's the question, because I really believe that, as I said earlier, as we trying to deal with the rationale and the motivation behind a given Interior Department decision, a policy change, a regulatory move, essential to us being able to perform our job and be responsive to the American people is information. Information that will deal with those two questions about rationale and motivation. And so with that, the question is a general question, Mr. Secretary, but I think it is one that's, that this cloud, the cloud that's being created right now by the Trump administration in terms of non-responsiveness to the majority in this House, I think is escalating. And my question is, what is the relationship between this committee, its majority, and your office and the Department of Interior?
So I respect the role of Congress to conduct oversight, and I believe that the department needs to be responsive. And at the same time, that interest is tempered by an interest that I have to also ensure that I am appropriately protective of the legitimate interests of the department and the executive branch. Now, my experience over the last 26 years has been that almost every item that Congress has an interest in, the two branches of government in good faith can find a way to come up with a reasonable accommodation that satisfies both protecting the department's interest and protecting yours. And when I look at, I asked for a comparison of the requests that had come in from you all and our responsiveness to them to the last time there was two houses, or a house and a different administration. And when I run the numbers, we've already provided over 66,000 pages of documentation in 10,000 documents. And I do recognize that one of the things I was thinking as I came up here is, to the extent that there is frustration, maybe one of the ways to do it is to sit down and have a discussion about developing a production schedule that you find mutually agreeable. There's some documentation when you ask for things that are in deliberative process there's some longstanding interest there that we want to maintain, but there may be ways to work through them. I'm sorry to go over time. I
No,
didn't
no,
realize
that's,
that.
I think,
But
yeah, that's the crux of the point. And I think that there's quantitative response to the request, and then there's qualitative response to the request. And that qualitative response to the request is our point, that, well, we have reams of paper. We don't have content that leads us to look at rationale and motivation. But with that, let me turn to the ranking member for his time. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. I realize, Secretary, that you've had 17 requests for documents so far. You've responded to 16 of them with something. I walked into our office back there with what has, actually, you've consumed our office right now with what you've sent up here, not only in substantive, but also qualitative. I will ask you later on about the relationship you actually have with the White House, simply because in past administrations, Interior Department was oftentimes overruled or told what to do by the White House. I'd give you a chance to think about that while I ask some other kinds of situations, though. There have been some vague and sometimes repeated accusations that your department is censoring science in favor of certain industries. If you recall, under the Obama administration, there were several scandals that undermined the scientific integrity of the department, including longstanding problems of USGS that went unaddressed by that administration. What is the current situation with science in the department? Are studies being tossed into the shredder as soon as they are printed out, as some people have implied?
No.
All right, your answer has to be at least as long as the question that I gave you, but other than that.
Now, let me say something about that. First off, the answer is no. I actually think that claims of scientific integrity misconduct are actually down over the last 2 years compared to the prior years. That's according to our scientific integrity team. Second, as soon as one of the first things I did as acting was I asked Bill Werkheiser, who's a career scientist who was the head of scientific integrity in the department, to come into my office and serve as my science advisor. I did that for a couple of reasons. I want to ensure that the information and advice I get is good, but it was also to ensure that we have a representative from my office that's liaisoning with all of the other bureau's science shops to ensure that they have a degree of comfort, that issues are being addressed. My view is we take the science as we find it. Generally, the science is one of, or science or fact is one of a couple of elements that go into a decision. Generally, a decision, at least from my perspective, typically is one that there's a legal framework for, there's a factual basis that needs to be, you need to have, and in certain decisions, not all, in certain decisions there's also an element of policy. Some decisions are pure science, some decisions are pure law, but in general, there's some intersection of all three of those, generally on more significant decisions.
Okay, I appreciate doing that. Let me tell you like 3 areas I'd like to talk about. Obviously, we won't get to it in the minute and 50 seconds I've got remaining. But there's a cumulative effect of the regulatory reform that's been going on. I mean, what would that actually mean to the American people? You have done in your department some creative things with fees and what you want to do with fees in the future, as well as you talked about reorganization. There is still some areas we need to explore about why that reorganization takes place. And I would like to know about the relationship that you have with the White House and Interior Department. Do you have really a free hand with the White House telling you what to do with Interior? That did not happen in the last administration. Which one of those do you want to hit first? You can probably get one or two.
Let me take the White House one, because as somebody who, I spent about 10 years in the Department of the Interior, and one thing I did not appreciate until I was made acting is the role a cabinet secretary plays in interacting with the president. I guess I had not given that a lot of thought, but I can tell you that the role is very direct, and And I think that that's a great thing for the department. The reality is the president is responsive when you call him, and he wants you to be responsive when he calls you. And it's really a positive thing that I was a little taken aback by. My first meeting with the president as acting, he asked me for my card. And I said, why would you need my card? And he said, because I might need to call you. And we talked about it, and he's called me regularly. And I think he's very hand-on. He's very decisive when you give him pros and cons. He's been very good to work with, and I feel very comfortable that I can go into his office.
Okay, we're out of time, but thank you.
Sorry.
Hopefully we'll get some of those other issues later
I'll
on.
get to them.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time to visit the Congressional office. In looking at your testimony and all the attachments, a paragraph was dedicated to the insular areas and the other compact impact nations. And I read that in 2020, the Office of Insular Affairs will implement activities to bolster health care quality. Mr. Secretary, the Northern Marianas and other insular areas all benefited from the supplemental Medicaid funding included in the ACA/PPA that expires on September 30th of this year, sir. We expect to hold a hearing soon in this committee on the impending Medicaid funding crisis. And I understand the federal family is also concerned about the potential harm to our health systems. Congress will surely have a role to play in addressing the Medicaid cliff affecting the insular areas, but you, sir, can assist us greatly, Mr. Secretary. You know what the federal family can do and what proposals the administration will support. If you could, please tell us how Congress may be able to help address this truly critical health issue.
So, Assistant Secretary Domenech, I know, is on top of that issue, and we'd be happy to sit down with you and to discuss a pathway forward. Medicare is sort of something that's not in my sweet spot of expertise, so I don't have a...
Okay, but the federal family maybe, all right.
We're happy to be, we're a pretty good voice internally for the insular areas, and I can tell you that if we get ourselves pointed in the right direction, we can help.
Thank you, because this is really an issue of life and death. Eventually.
I appreciate
Thank
that.
you. So, Mr. Secretary, you mentioned that you would probably get Assistant Secretary Domenech to talk to us on this Medicaid crisis and see where we could help each other address this issue for our mutual constituents in the insular areas. So I'm wondering maybe if this would do, because we discussed this also in your visit. I want to ask you whether you have talked to Assistant Secretary Domenech about the energy action plans required by federal law for each insular area. In our meeting earlier, we talked about the requirements of the 2014 law. Your department is supposed to create expert teams to help each insular area draw up a plan. The plan is supposed to set goals for reducing foreign energy and increasing domestic energy, sir. The Secretary, you, sir, are supposed to approve the plan. And every year, Congress is supposed to get a report from you on the progress towards meeting specific benchmarks. So all with an eye on reducing electricity rates for my constituents, rates that are still 4 times higher in the Marianas than the national average and have not changed in the years since the law was enacted. I did get a letter from Mr. Domenech with information about energy strategies each insular area has and a record of energy grants that Interior has awarded, and we thank you for that. But it all seemed a bit unfocused, and as I say, despite millions of dollars spent, Mr. Secretary, electricity costs has not changed, at least not in the Northern Marianas. So were you able to have that talk with Mr. Secretary Domenech about implementing the law, Public Law 113-235? What can you tell me about this, Mr. Secretary?
Secretary Domenech is looking very carefully to see if he's complying, and he will be.
if he's complying with the law?
Yeah, absolutely. He will, if we're late on those reports, he's going to be working on it.
Respectfully, Mr. Secretary, has Department of Interior sent at least one report to
He,
Congress
I told him,
since
we're going to be
2014,
in
15,
compliance.
16, 17, 18, 5 years?
We're going to be in compliance.
All right. Okay, so, man, I don't have too much time. I may have to submit, yeah, I appreciate, Mr. Secretary, that in that one paragraph, your department has brought up the concern about the waning influence of the United States in the Pacific and the rise of Chinese interests. I appreciate that, you know, the United States has been leadership, is provided leadership that countries in the Pacific look to for economic, political, and defense guidance. However, our allies in the region are increasingly engaging with China that has been more than willing to fill the void caused by our nation's increasing isolationist policy. But I appreciate that your department is going to look into that. I appreciate that heads of states are going to be visiting soon. And thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for today.
We're spending a significant amount of time with other larger agencies discussing the need for us to be very smart in the insular areas across the board. And I think you're getting, I think that there's tremendous interest in making sure that we're well represented in the United States.
Thank you.
Let me,
There's
the
two
time is way up,
masked
sir.
people masked back there.
Mr. Bland, I think we're done with the time. Thank you. Mr. Lumber?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Bernhardt, I'm glad that you're here. You are uniquely qualified to be a Secretary of the Interior. You've been a Chief of Staff to the Secretary. You've been a Director of Congressional and Legislative Affairs in the Department. And you were a Senate-confirmed solicitor under President Bush. So you have background in the policy, managerial, intergovernmental, and oversight roles that any secretary needs to master. So I think the people of the country are well served to have you in this position. I appreciate that. And you're a native of Colorado, so you understand the West and Colorado in particular, and I appreciate that also. Let me ask you about reorganization of the department. There's been a push from some of the Colorado representatives, and I think others in the West, to bring some of the Washington, D.C. offices west of the Mississippi, so they're closer to where the policies are actually enacted, and it's easier to get around and see firsthand what the policies, what the effect they are on the land itself. So I think it makes a lot of sense to reorganize and bring some offices to the west. And some of the places that we're pushing for and would suggest for your consideration are Grand Junction, which is in Scott Tipton's district, Colorado Springs, which is in my district, and the Denver metro area, which has 5 representatives, including Joe Neguse and Diana DeGitt, who are on this committee. So what can you tell us about upcoming timeline to announce anything that might happen with reorganization?
So Secretary Zinke had a very ambitious reorganization proposal that really, from my perspective, included 3 parts. The first part was a unified regional boundary structure for our bureaus, an internal management device. And we worked with Congress, and in August of last year, structured the boundaries to be the same for regional boundaries for all of the bureaus except for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education. And that means that we came up here and asked for reprogramming, and that's locked in. Those bureaus are, those boundaries are made, and they just need to be implemented. We now have the other 2 pieces of the Secretary's vision to deal with. The first, or the second one, was moving some of the headquarters west. And I'm very committed to working to achieve that. Certainly, some of the communities you mentioned are logical places. Other members have slightly different views. But I would expect that certainly by this summer, we're setting up a reprogramming request regarding a potential move of some of the folks in the Bureau of Land Management and potentially the U.S. Geological Survey. So that's something that's long. I mean, I've seen committee transcripts back to 1936 where they were talking about the need for senior management to be further west. So that's going to happen, I think.
Excellent.
The third piece was a piece that Secretary Zinke had, which was to create a kind of a regional commander in each of these regions and create a relatively large bureaucracy. And I'm not sold on that piece of it, so we're tweaking that.
Okay, thank you.
So that's where we are.
Excellent.
So all of those communities you mentioned are in the running.
Okay, excellent. And changing gears, I want to ask about the Department of Ethics Office, and what are you doing to transform the ethics program to make it even more robust? I know that you have some career federal ethics officials that you consult with regularly, including Vice President Joe Biden's senior ethics official, Scott De La Vega. So what are you doing in the ethics office there at Interior?
So our ethics program over a long period of time has been subject to significant criticism. Both the ethics office and the the Inspector General's office at different times in the prior administration requested additional money for ethics, and that money didn't arrive. And I think, frankly, the state of that office did not help Secretary Zinke when he arrived. So the steps that we've taken so far, we've elevated the reporting structure of the designated agency ethics official, who's the top person in ethics. We brought in additional people. Overall at the department, I think we've hired 42 additional ethics counselors. We are going through a second phase of modifying the reporting structure to ensure that they're all reporting to the career ethics officials. I think it's an unprecedented effort to ensure that we have a culture of compliance within the department. And so we've done a lot there.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back. Thank you for your answer. I'd like to, for unanimous consent, introduce a letter dated March 25th of this year from the Interior to Senators Warren and Blumenthal on an ethics issue that I think is of concern. I'd just like to have it introduced into the record by unanimous consent.
Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I hope we agree that public service is a public trust, especially with an office like yours, which is entrusted with overseeing vast public resources for the American people. So let's start with a basic question. Do you agree that our ethics rules exist not just to avoid actual conflicts of interest, but to avoid the appearance of a conflict so that the public can have trust and confidence in our government?
Well, I would say that 2635 CFR 502.
It's a yes or no question, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, addresses
Thank
impartiality.
you. Thank you. And I know that same
Impartiality.
standard is reflected in your own recusal letter. Mr. Secretary, before you joined the administration, you were a lobbyist and lawyer for the Westlands Water District. And your work for that client included lobbying on the WIN Act, signed into law in late 2016, correct?
I certainly worked at different times on provisions that were included within the WIN Act, yes.
Right. Now, Mr. Secretary, the WIN Act was a huge water bill. It had lots of sections. It had WRDA, all of these Corps of Engineers provisions, had some money for Flint, Michigan, water needs, recycling, desalination, some tribal water rights settlements. You didn't lobby on any of those sections. You're lobbying for Westlands, focused on efforts to increase Central Valley Project pumping from the Delta, specifically sections 4001 and 4003 of Subtitle J of the WIN Act, correct?
I think it was more focused on 4002.
Okay, but specific sections involving Delta operations that affected Westlands, correct?
I certainly would say 4002 falls into that category. And I'm not sure I would say that it affects Westlands necessarily, but it's certainly that provision.
Well, Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, those two specific sections involving Delta operations were a giant thumb on the scale against endangered fish in the Delta and in favor of the Westlands Water District. It was your thumb when you helped write those sections, and by the way, you'd been advocating for these things for several years on behalf of Westlands, and it's your thumb now as the person in charge of interpreting these laws and implementing them. But your lobbying work for Westlands on these things didn't count. You would argue it didn't even count toward your 2-year recusal under the Trump Ethics Pledge, correct?
Before I was even seriously considering coming into the department as deputy, I told Secretary Zinke that before I did that.
Mr. Secretary, I don't have time for a narrative. The question is, did your lobbying for Westlands on these specific sections of the WIN Act count toward your 2-year recusal under the Trump Ethics Pledge?
Those specific activities regarding Public Law 114322, which is the WIN Act, those activities were viewed to not constitute lobbying on a particular matter, which
Right,
is
and that's significant.
Which is a specific term
Reclaiming
of
my
art.
time. That's a
Which is
specific term of art.
art.
This is my time, Mr. Secretary. It's important that you use that parsed specific term of art, because even though there were specific sections benefiting your client, if you can say that they didn't constitute a particular matter, you got a 5-month head start working on those things on behalf of Westlands as Secretary of Interior. You got 5 months in which your recusal didn't apply, correct?
It's not my view. What I did is I went to the career ethics officials.
And you convinced him that didn't constitute a particular matter. Do you think, Mr. Secretary, by parsing in that way, do you think you're upholding the standard of ethics we talked about at the beginning of my question?
I absolutely do, because 502, impartiality, goes to particular matters involving specific parties. And my action is completely consistent with OGE guidance, guidance from my ethics officials, and I have followed their guidance to a T. And that's been reaffirmed in multiple efforts.
Mr. Secretary, Westlands was by no means your only client. You also represented the Independent Petroleum Association of America. I'm sure you're aware of how your former clients in the oil and gas industry have boasted about their special access to you. At a 2017 meeting, Dan Natz, the director of the IPAA, boasted about how well he knew you, saying, "We have direct access to him, conversations about issues ranging from federal land access to the ESA." This was during your recusal. Was he just confused about who he thought he was talking to during this period?
Well, I can say emphatically, I haven't talked to Dan Natz since I walked into the department.
So he was just
Probably.
wrong when he told a room full of oil and gas executives that he was having these conversations
He
with you?
certainly didn't have any conversations with me when I got to Interior a day after, or
Thank you,
any
Mr.
day after that.
Thank you, sir. Mr. McClintock?
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, just to follow up on this, just to be very clear, you have DOI career ethics officials, and they've determined that your recusal is not required. Am I correct?
That is right. That is exactly right.
And there is a memo to Scott De La Vega, who's the director of the Department of the Ethics Office of the DOI, from Heather Guthrie and Edward McConnell. A very lengthy document, but it concludes that both the draft EIS NOI and the 2009 BA are matters as defined in the memorandum. As such, DOI employees are not required to recuse from participation in either the draft EIS NOI or the 2019 BA.
That's correct.
Great. In fact, Mr. Chairman, I'd like unanimous consent to submit that for the record. Mr. Chairman, unanimous consent to. Mr. Bernhardt, first and foremost, and I've mentioned this before, but I want to thank you again for your exemplary leadership as acting secretary during the shutdown this past winter. It was a stark contrast to how the Obama administration administered the shutdown in 2013. As you know, I have Yosemite Valley and Yosemite National Park in my district, as well as Sequoia and Kings Canyon, critically important to tourism and to the economies. In 2013, during the shutdown, the Obama administration deliberately closed closed and locked the gates. They forced every business conducting business to shut down just because they were on a national park property. They went so far as to barricade the turnouts on the highway overlooking the valley so people couldn't stop, get out of their cars, and even get a glimpse of the valley. When you took over as acting secretary, we had a shutdown. You went to extraordinary lengths to keep the park open. Businesses continued to operate. Reservations continued to be honored. The park gates were open, and you did exemplary service in keeping the parks clean, safe, and open for business through the shutdown. And again, on behalf of all of the visitors of Yosemite Valley and the Gateway communities, I want to thank you again for your service in that regard. And again, the contrast with the Obama administration was just stunning.
Thank you.
You're familiar with the California State Resource Control, Water Resource Control Board unimpaired flow rule. We have had record rainfall. That unimpaired rule is going to require the early draining of our reservoirs. Central Valley farmers are only getting a fraction of the water that they are entitled to. What can we do to mitigate this ridiculous rule from the State Water Resources Control Board?
Well, Brenda Berman is really on point as the Commissioner of Reclamation. We have, obviously participated in the board activities and probably will end up participating in litigation, depending on what they go. We actually have a very good dialogue right now with the governor's office. I think his head of natural resources was in the department yesterday or the day before. And so, I'm optimistic that we can find a good pathway forward that's not irresponsible for everyone.
The Shasta raise, the 18.5-foot addition to the Shasta Dam would add about 600,000 acre-feet of water yield to the water available to California, and yet it is not included in the appropriations bill for this year. Would you consider that a shovel-ready project?
Well, when Representative Calvert asked us to look at all of our projects, it was the one that Reclamation thought had the shortest window. There's a variety of projects in California. People have a variety of views on them, but obviously it's up there.
Could you give us a quick assessment of the risk of catastrophic wildfire on interior lands and what needs to be done to give you the tools to address that threat?
Well, what we've asked for in our budget, well, first off, we're doing a lot. The President issued a executive order late last winter. Secretary Zinke issued a secretarial order to follow on that, and we had a little slowdown with the shutdown, but I think we're really on top of things pretty well this year. That said, we have asked for additional tools as part of our budget. We've proposed 6 different categorical exclusions we'd like to see, and we'd like to work with Congress to try and get those codified.
Great. Well, I'd be very interested in your elaborating on that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Bernhardt, I appreciate your having taken the time to meet with me just a few weeks ago. When you were in my office, we discussed a number of letters that Chairman Grijalva and I have sent to the Department of Interior that we have not received a response on. One of those letters, I'd like to go into greater detail, is the one regarding the renewal of 2 mining leases right next to the Boundary Waters Wilderness in Minnesota. These were 2 leases that the Obama administration had canceled, and it just so happens that are owned by a mining company run by Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump's landlord here in D.C. In early February of 2017, Interior employees were circulating 2 documents through email. One was a briefing memo on this topic, and the other one was a document on withdrawal options. Chairman and I, on March 12th, sent a very specific request for these documents, including their file names with a March 15th response deadline. But as of today, I've not seen the briefing memo or the withdrawal options document. Will your department fulfill this very specific request by the end of this week, these 2 specific documents?
I'm not familiar with exactly the contents of those 2 documents, but I will promise you, I'll leave here today, I'll go look at them, and if I think that they're anything we can share, I'll do one of 2 things. I'll either share them with you, or I'll tell you you're welcome to come over and look at them.
Well, let's talk about what you will share, what you have shared. You know, this past Friday, and thank you for that, and we received our first response to another letter that we sent to you on the topic of the mining leases near the Boundary Waters wilderness. We received our first response on this topic. We sent this letter on March 1st requesting all information on the boundary, on the mining leases. I think it'll be on the, this is the response that, well, let me rephrase what we found. We got thousands of documents, thousands of files. Let me tell you, these files, as of Friday, which we received at 5 p.m.
Is this still on the Boundary Waters, or is
Yeah,
it?
this is on the Boundary Waters. We received 3,884 pages of documents. As you can see on the slide, 19% were duplicates. The vast majority of the others were already public documents, which we went through, 59%. There's total redaction of some pages, but it included unredacted phone numbers next to it, but everything else was redacted. Several pages of code. Can we say the next slide? See this? I call this the gibberish slide. We have no idea what this is, but you sent it on. Then if we look at the next slide, it says briefing. That's what we asked for in the other one. The briefing memo. It's not really clear exactly what's in the briefing memo. Is this the briefing memo that you were supposed to send us? If you look at the slide, is this our briefing memo?
So I will say this. I've spent years in civil litigation, and so I've seen a lot of documents that look like this. And the reality is that
I'm sure you were as curious as we were about what this is.
And it's my experience in dealing with that if there's a particular document that you're worried about being over-redacted, we have a conversation on that and try and figure it out.
Okay.
I think
let's get back. You said, let's go on. You said that you would review and find out about the briefing memo and the withdrawal options of these slides, and you will get back to us. You know, also, we also have in the next slide, if you look at the next slide, yeah, you recently, let's go on, sent on to us slides that labeled the FOIA exemption, stating that the FOIA exemption was pre-decisional. As you understand, and I'm sure you have, that was on this slide, Congress is not subject to the FOIA, so I expect you to provide the actual documents.
I do. I learned that lesson very early in my career at Interior. I made the mistake of
okay, I'm going to yield back, and I hope that we
got in a lot of trouble. I've learned that one well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva. Secretary Bernhardt, thank you for coming today, for your testimony, and for the work that you're doing and that the administration's getting done at the Department of Interior. I would say welcome to the home of the big bun. Some people may not understand the reference, but from my childhood days in the 1980s, there was a famous TV commercial about hamburgers, and these ladies were at the home of the Big Bun, and they were looking for the beef, and they always ask, where's the beef? And as we look at the subject of the hearing today, looking at the administration's budget, I think that's a good question, is where's the beef? And that's not the question to the administration, but that would be a question to Congress, because as we know, and we've talked about some constitutional issues in here, Article 1 says that budgeting is the responsibility of the Congress, and the Congress has no budget. There's not a budget that's been passed out of the Budget Committee. There's not a budget that's been presented on the floor. And by the process that Congress is supposed to follow to write appropriation bills, I'm not sure how that process can ever work, since we don't even have a budget to start with. So I commend the administration for at least putting a budget suggestion together. And again, that's all it is a suggestion, because again, it's Congress's role to provide a budget. And you've prepared the administration's budget saying this is our suggestion on how we could actually operate the department. So we talk a lot about things that I'm not sure are doing a lot of good for the country, and we fail to look at the good things that have been done for the work that you all are getting done. And you know, one issue that's very important to me, and I think it's important to all members of this committee, regardless of party, is the devastating wildfires that we've seen. I know that the President signed Executive Order 13855 that was to promote active management of our nation's forests and to reduce wildfire risk, and he got criticized in the press for that executive order. But I would also like to note that this is a bipartisan issue. Governor Newsom in California also had an executive order, and I want to read a quote from Governor Newsom when he issued the executive order, which was to accelerate forest management in California to reduce the risk of wildfire. He said, and I quote, "The increasing wildfire risk we face as a state mean we simply can't wait until a fire starts in order to start deploying emergency resources. California needs sustained focus and immediate action in order to better protect our communities." I wholeheartedly agree with that. I believe it's not just California, it's many states that need that. It's many states that the Department of Interior operates in. So my first question to you is, what is the Interior Department doing to implement the President's executive order on federal lands to make our communities safer?
So the first thing that we did is Secretary Zinke issued a secretarial order shortly after the President issued his. I think the President issued his executive order on the 21st of December or thereabouts. I think Secretary Zinke issued a secretarial order on, well, obviously before January 2nd. And that order set up some clear direction to our bureaus, and then each of the bureaus have moved forward in executing on that. We think we're going to meet the President's objectives. We've also, in our budget, asked for some additional legislative language to potentially make things easier in terms of categorical exclusions. And we'd like to work with Congress on finding some clear legislative solutions. But in the interim, we're moving forward. We have a number of plans that we're going to announce in terms of vegetation management plans that will also be going through an EIS process. So I think we're on top of things this year, but you know, we hope that the fire season's not extraordinary.
And then I just want to go back to the Minnesota mine issue, just to address that issue. I want to ask you, would it be more accurate to say that the Obama-era withdrawal, which was officially noticed January 19th, 2017, the day before President Trump's inauguration, was that the unusual action, particularly considering the bipartisan support the lease has enjoyed from Minnesota's congressional delegation?
Well, I'm not going to opine on last-minute decisions. I will say this, that I think by noon today, there will be an announcement on twin metals on the two leases that the Congressman referenced regarding BLM's action on those two leases. So I would expect that would come sometime Maybe now, maybe in an hour.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, earlier this year, Congress has passed a public lands bill by a huge bipartisan margin that permanently reauthorized the Land and Water Conservation Fund. That's why I was so disturbed by the fact that your department's budget plans to nearly eliminate the fund. Despite your department's lack of interest, Congress is strongly committed to funding this popular and effective program. Will you commit to dispersing LWCF funding in a timely manner when appropriated by Congress?
Yeah, if Congress gives us the money, I promise that we'll appropriate it promptly.
Great. Mr. Steger, as I'm sure you're aware, a week ago today, the President tweeted out his opposition to H.R. 312, the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe Reservation Reaffirmation Act, as it was about to come to the House floor. He wrote, quote, "Republicans shouldn't vote for H.R. 312, a special interest casino bill backed by Elizabeth Pocahontas Warren. It is unfair and doesn't treat Native Americans equally." So for now, I'll ignore the racist slur in his tweet and in general the lies. I want to focus on the President's bizarre opposition to a small bipartisan bill that is broadly supported by dozens of tribes, tribal organizations, and state and local governments. Secretary Bernhardt, yes or no? Are you familiar with the bill in question?
I'm not familiar with the specific contents of the bill.
Okay, this bill would reaffirm Mashpee Tribe's 12,000-year homeland and help save them from bankruptcy. Did the President consult with you about this issue before sending out that tweet? Yes or no?
He may have consulted with the department, but he didn't consult with me specifically.
You may have. To your knowledge, did the President consult with the Mashpee Tribe before sending out that tweet?
I have no idea.
To your knowledge, did the President consult with the National Congress of American Indians before sending out that tweet?
I have no idea.
Do you know if the President talked to any tribes or tribal organizations about this issue before he tweeted?
I have no idea.
Okay, so the President did not confer with you, his highest-ranking official of the Department of Interior, or to your knowledge, any tribes or organizations before...
The President does not need to consult with me on any tweet he wants to send.
Okay, good to hear. Good to know. We'll continue here. Any tribes? He didn't talk to you. He didn't talk to you before making this decision. Didn't talk to any of the tribal organizations, and clearly doesn't respect your department. If the recommendation for this tweet didn't come from you, it makes me wonder where it come from. I'm taking my time. This is my time. Mr. Secretary, do you know who Matt Schlapp of Cove Strategies is?
Do I know who Matt Schlapp is?
Of Cove Strategies.
I know who Matt Schlapp is. I'm not sure what the name of the company. I didn't hear that. But.
So for those who don't know, I'm glad you do know, Matt Schlapp is the lobbyist for Twin River Casino, which opposes granting Mashpee its ancestral homeland because they're worried about a potential tribal casino will hurt their business. Matt Schlapp is a Republican donor. He has close ties to the White House, CPAC, and the President has called him a fantastic friend and supporter. He also happens to be married to the President's Director of Strategic Communications. Have you, or to the best of your knowledge, or anyone at Interior ever spoken to Matt Schlapp or Cove Strategies regarding the Mashpee bill, or this issue in general?
Not to my knowledge.
Not to your knowledge, okay. Mr. Secretary, are you aware of any communication that the President has had with Matt Schlapp or Cove Strategies regarding the Mashpee bill?
No.
I have a lobbying report right here from Cove Strategies that says that Matt Schlapp lobbied the executive office of the President earlier this year on behalf of Twin River Casino. Twin Rivers has paid 3 separate lobbying firms so far this year. The other 2 have only lobbied the House and the Senate. Matt Schlapp, with his close ties to the White House, is the only one who lobbied the executive office of the President. So the President may not have consulted with you, Mashpee, or any other tribal organizations, or any within your department before sending out his tweet and influencing the outcome of the legislation. But it seems pretty clear to me that who he was listening to was a high-powered special interest lobbyist with deep pockets and political connections. Allowing lobbyists and special interests to drive this administration.
I don't think that's necessarily true.
Well, it's certainly been proven true so far. Allowing lobbyists and special interests to drive this administration's policy towards sovereign tribes is disturbing. Despite the President's interference on this bill, which recognizes a homeland that the Mashpee have lived on for thousands of years before they were greeted by the Pilgrims, we will be passing H.R. 312 out of the House on the floor today. As the Secretary of the Interior, I think you should let the President know that it is our federal trust responsibility to enter into government-to-government consultations with tribes for making decisions that impact them, not to launch racist unilateral attacks on the tribe sovereignty on Twitter. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Member Bishop, for holding this hearing. And thank you and welcome, Secretary Bernhardt, for coming today to discuss DOI's priorities, policy priorities. Now, Mr. Secretary, What is your opinion on former Secretary Zinke's monument review, specifically regarding his recommendations for the marine monuments? And what is DOI's current stance on the issue of fishing access in and around the Rose Atoll and Pacific Remote Islands National Monuments? And will you be making your own recommendations to the President?
So the president directed Secretary Zinke to review the monuments and create a report. And Secretary Zinke did that, and that report was submitted to the president. And the president will decide whether he wants to act on any, or he's obviously acted on some of the provisions. He may act on other recommendations, and I would expect that he might. He hasn't asked me for a second report, so our position is they have the report, and it's in the president's hands right now, and he will make some decisions, I expect. Obviously, in terms of access, public access is a centerpiece of our interests at the department, and so access is important to us.
Okay, so the next question is, and you may have partially answered it already, but you could spend all day responding to this question, but please instead only take a couple of sentences if possible. What is the department doing to enhance public land access and recreational use for the average American?
So I actually think this is going to end up being a major milestone of the president's tenure. First off, we are committed to public access. We're committed to increasing hunting, fishing, angling, and recreational opportunities. And I frankly think that the bill you all worked together to pass in such a bipartisan fashion gives us a number of things to even carry that farther forward. My expectation is we'll be announcing soon over 1 million acres of additional public access just on refuge areas. So we're excited about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for being here, Secretary Bernhardt. I do want to touch on the Reorganization Land and Water Conservation Fund. It passed 92-8 in the Senate, 363-62 in the House, and I think everybody on this committee voted for that. And so certainly a victory for conservation, showing the strong bipartisan support of protecting access to our public lands. And certainly in my district, it's helped fund Schaffer Park in Selma, Hanford Sports Park, and the National Park Sequoia and Kings Canyon, just to the east of my district. And so, this is one of the most successful conservation programs we have. And so I think all of us here were very concerned when the Interior's budget, when your budget included a 95% reduction in funding for the fund. And as you testified earlier, your role is to, quote, work hard to effectuate the president's vision, which is the elimination of this fund. So can you explain why these cuts were proposed from the Interior Department? And as you testified, if there are funding that you will, if the funds are appropriated, you will expend those funds, but that would seem to be a direct contravention of the president's vision. And so how do you reconcile that?
Well, to your last question, it's my understanding the president proposes and the Congress disposes when it comes to appropriations, and that's the way our Constitution works. In terms of LWCF, I would say this, that we're thrilled that you created the permanent authorization. It's my experience that since LWCF has been enacted, there's been 2 years that it's been fully funded. And I actually think that the fact that it's reauthorized permanently gives me an opportunity in the next budget to push harder in our internal budget debates about it. But if you look at our budget overall and you compare our budget to EPA and DOE and other similarly sort of situated agencies, I think we did pretty good in the internal process. But we'll spend money that if Congress gives us for LWCF, And the question was really, I think, can we get it out quickly? And the answer to that is yes. We appreciate that you reauthorized it.
No, the question was more, the president's vision, as enacted by his budget request, which came from Interior, I'm assuming, was to terminate the program, to reduce it by 95%.
It was
and although
to
that the money may be appropriated, it's still against the president's vision, which you said you're working to enact, and not spend the money.
I don't think that's the case. I think the president said this year, this is what we'd like. You all take that and you decide what you like, and then we implement whatever you like. And the president's not going to say, if you appropriate it, we can't spend it.
What if the president would say, I don't want you to spend it on parks, I want you to spend it on a border wall?
Probably don't want to get into a legal argument about the president's authority, but I don't know if that would be
That was certainly a question that was raised earlier, and we know how everyone voted on that. But no, thanks very much with regard to that, because I know you are a strong supporter of public lands and access to public lands. But I do see that conflict between yourself, the Interior Department, and the administration. The other question I'd like to ask is about climate change, and I'm particularly interested in the threat that climate change poses to water infrastructure and water security in California, notwithstanding the other states. And we're expected to endure longer, more frequent droughts, higher temperatures, earlier spring runoffs. And I want to know more about how the department is incorporating climate change into your infrastructure management.
Well, I think everybody recognizes that the climate is changing. Where we go in terms of thinking through these issues is a place that the fourth assessment and the USGS scientists all agree on, and that is that the largest uncertainty in projecting future climate conditions is the level of GHG going forward. And so what our scientists tell us are the best practices to use in thinking through these issues is that we recognize that there's not one particular model that's going to be the probabilistic answer. You need to look at all of the models and a full range of models, and then look at within that range. And they've said that use multiple models, use multiple representative concentration pathways, and you know, that's what we're trying to do with our decisions, to ensure that we have the full range of modeling and then utilize it as appropriate. And if you look at our written decisions, you'd see that that's the case.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning and congratulations on your recent confirmation, Mr. Secretary. I do have many questions, but I'll try to focus on just on one. The first is that I do understand that the administration held a significant offshore wind lease in December of last year for the coast of Massachusetts, totaling $405 million in revenue. And I do understand this will mean a significant growth for the industry and Americans that are living in the mainland. I don't know if you're aware, but we introduced with a group of members in this committee a bill that will promote the same kind of opportunities of offshore wind for the territories as well. It was passed unanimously for this committee and is going to the floor. Is your department supporting this kind of bill?
I'm not familiar with that specific legislation and whether we took a particular approach to it, but I would say that as a concept, we would absolutely be supportive of providing opportunities for the insular areas to develop their resources in a responsible way, of course.
I do understand that the Royalty Policy Committee recommended pursuing the change, and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management supported similar draft legislation that passed this House of Representatives last year and during the last Congress.
So
right?
you're more familiar with it than
So
I am. We're not going to change our position, I can promise you that.
That was what I wanted to hear. Thank you for letting me know that. As you may know, the Department of Interior got important fortifications in the island and jurisdiction over many sites like the San Juan National Historic Park, which includes important 16th century fortifications from the Spanish colonial era, among many other sites. One of the questions that we did have during the last budget last year, it was about letters coming from the loss of 40 masons for the Department
Well,
of
let
Interior.
me tell you, I can answer that right now. I don't know if it'll be 40, it may be less than that, but I am issuing an order today that will allow recreational fee dollars to be used for permanent employees for certain situations. And one of those would be, in my opinion, the masons, or some of the masons in, I think it's the fort at San Juan. So I think we're about to take care of that, and what I can do is have somebody call you this afternoon with the specific details.
I really appreciate that.
But it is a problem, and I think we've figured out a solution for you.
I'm glad to hear that. I do know that we got 88 employees, full-time employees at that fort, but those 40 masons are doing a great job in maintaining.
I've been there, I've seen their work, and it's really unprecedented.
Some members of this committee, we traveled to Puerto Rico a few weeks ago, and we visited El Yunque, which is the only national rainforest in the U.S. And the portal or the visitor center was hit directly
With the hurricane.
with the hurricane. Although the funds are being allocated to the island, allocated to the Department of Interior to do the repairs in that area. It's been a year and a half, and we haven't seen anything being done yet. You got any information on that?
We have, the Fish and Wildlife Service has actually done a pretty good job of trying to obligate money. One of the challenges in those situations is there's such a demand for contractors that it is challenging. I'll look into that specifically, but I know we are having some difficulties in that regard.
And I do know that the Department of Interior presence is also seen through of course, the Fish and Wildlife, as you just mentioned that. And we do have 5 national wildlife refuges in 5 islands, Desecheo, Cartagena, Culebra, Vieques. And I'm pleased to hear that the President's budget request for National Wildlife System is $509 million, an increase of $23 million from the last fiscal year. Where that money is going to be used?
I'm not 100% sure about that. I'll have to get back to you on that one specifically.
So in your view, that provision of $23 million will help strengthen the national wildlife refuges across the nation, including those in Puerto Rico?
Well, that would be our hope, yeah.
I mean, why you ask for 3?
We better do better, right?
If you can later on provide a detail of the breakdown of the total cost of deferred maintenance projects across the 5 national wildlife refuges in Puerto Rico, I will really,
Okay.
and I will submit the rest of the questions for the record.
We'll do that.
I yield back.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for coming today and for your testimony. I want to start by just with reference and great respect to my colleague, Mr. Westerman, who posed the question of where's the beef, and I think it's an appropriate question. I would say the title of this hearing is the budget priorities of the Department of Interior and policy priorities of the Department of Interior, and so certainly that's where my questions will be focused. And to that end, I think it can get lost in some of the exchanges just how much the department's proposed budget, which I understand is a proposal, and that obviously Congress and our appropriators will be doing the bulk of the work in preparing a final budget, but nonetheless, just how much the budget decimates some really important programs. A decrease of $18.6 million for National Park Visitor Services. As you know, Mr. Secretary, or as you may know, I represent the 2nd District in Colorado, which includes Rocky Mountain National Park.
My wife and I were married in Estes, right outside of Rocky.
I proposed to my wife in Estes.
Oh, did you?
So glad that we have that in common. But nonetheless, the $18.6 million decrease in park services for the millions of visitors that will be visiting my district in the coming months is cause for great concern. a decrease of $12.9 million for resource stewardship, $11 million to implement the Endangered Species Act, an $11.6 million decrease for fish and aquatic conservation, the elimination of the National Wildlife Refugee Fund, the elimination of science support programs, juxtaposed against a 66.4% increase in coal management programs, and a $1.4 million increase to expedite permitting for oil and gas. And so, Mr. Secretary, I would just say I agree with Mr. Cox and other colleagues of mine that budget fundamentally reflects our values, and I don't agree with the budget priorities as the Department of Interior has laid them out. I want to focus in particular on the LWCF program. And if you could kind of just help us, Mr. Secretary, understand the reasoning behind the department's decision to really decimate that program and cut it by 105%. Because I understand, we looked back, I have a tweet, not my tweet, your tweet here, we can enter to the record, from February 15th of this year that says, quote, from Secretary David Bernhardt at Sec Bernhardt, there's a lot to agree on in the public lands package from the Senate. The Trump administration fully supports reauthorizing LWCF, and we included it in our budget last year. And yet, 1 month later, we have a budget from the Department of Interior that cuts by 105% that very same program.
So that tweet was in reference to reauthorization, but you know, we received in our budget, I think, something that we can all agree on, and I'd love, given your passion for the parks, to have us all work on, and that is creating a infrastructure fund to deal with our maintenance backlog issues, which are extreme. They're extreme in Rocky Mountain, they're extreme in Acadia, they're extreme everywhere. And that is not an insignificant thing to get through the budget. I mean, I think it's about a $6.5 billion proposal. And
I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary.
And it is a major commitment to
I
parks and
appreciate
infrastructure.
that. I appreciate
And
that. I'm going to reclaim my time.
I do appreciate
Because I
it.
have limited time. I appreciate that. I'm certainly appreciative of that commitment. I would just say I would hope that it would be mirrored in the fundamental program around land acquisition for the LWCF. So, but I think you understand my point. I'll move on to just one other topic. I believe you're probably aware of a woman by the name of Maria Caffrey, who was a researcher at CU Boulder in my district. Dr. Caffrey was contracted with the National Park Service to lead a report on the effects of sea level rise and storm surge on national parks. Before the final version of the report was published, she was repeatedly pressured to remove any references to the human causes of climate change from the report. Dr. Caffrey believed that the science of the report required a discussion on the human impact of climate change and ultimately adamantly refused. Fortunately, after the incident was publicized in an investigative report, major backlash ensued. The report was released with its original language. My understanding, so before I came to Congress, was thanks to the chairman's leadership and the leadership of several other members of this committee, a request was made of the Department of Interior's Inspector General to look into this issue. The unfortunate aspect of this is that the IG subsequently, after the report was released without the edits, closed that investigation. I would hope that you would support the Inspector General taking another look, particularly given what I understand to be recent reports in the news around the fact that the doctor's contract was recently expired and not renewed in February of this year, and that there is some controversy around that aspect of it.
So I'm not, I will say this, I'm not sure that, I haven't looked at what the Inspector General said specifically, but my understanding, and I can go back and check this when I get back to the office and give you a call if this is wrong, but my understanding is what the Inspector General actually did is said, hey, this looks like a matter of scientific integrity, and so it was sent to the scientific integrity team, and that they looked at it and decided there wasn't an issue. But I'll go back and double check that for you, but that's my understanding. It's not that the IG just said, we're not doing anything. They said, hey, this is probably better for this group, and they looked at it. But I'll go back and double check.
I would just say, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and with respect to that particular issue, to the extent that the IG did not essentially hold their investigation in abeyance or close it because the issue was rendered moot, if that's not the case, then I would appreciate your support.
I don't know. I'll ask Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, Secretary. Congratulations on your confirmation. Thank you for being here with us today and staying with us so long. Due to a great bipartisan effort, we passed a major public lands package beginning of this year. One of the largest bills in there was also due to some great bipartisan work, the Emory County Public Lands Bill. over 1 million acres in my district. In rare form, we were actually able to agree on what to do with public lands. Inside that is a lot of work. In some cases, the work has just started. It started the Sitla Exchange, the San Rafael Swell Recreation Area Management Plan, Jurassic National Monument Management Plan. Given your shortage of resources and the many things that you have to do, can you see a path forward to put the resources into these management plans and the Sitla exchanges?
So let me tell you what I have done there. Shortly after the bill was signed into law, I sent an order to all of our bureau directors demanding the following: that we go through the statute, look at those provisions that were in it, identify those provisions that needed some sort of implementation, and they gave me the overall list a while ago, and then I asked them to go back and develop an implementation plan for each of those priority items. I think that had a deadline of day 60, which would probably be the 22nd of this month. What I can do is come talk to you or visit with you after I get that on the 22nd, because I think we'll have a plan and we will get it done.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Sitla alone represents millions of dollars in these exchanges for our schools in Utah, and just really critical. Thank you for
I know how important it is.
Yeah, thank you for your special attention to that. We've got kind of a really unique situation in Carbon County. The Bureau of Reclamation, years ago, there were some homes built in the wrong spot on their property, some private cabins. And the Bureau's been doing quiet title to take these back. And we, with the ranking member and Senator Romney, we sent a letter to thank you for your response to that letter. This may be down too much into the weeds for you, but would love your help and attention on trying to resolve this in a way that doesn't destroy these cabins if there is an answer in there that works both for the federal government and
I'll talk to Brenda about it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And also, big thanks to you and Superintendent Kate Cannon and the Arches for a very, very difficult issue. The way that's been handled, I think, is very important. The residents of that town feel listened to. Thank you for that, and for the many people in your organization that have made that possible. Also, just kind of a plug to keep that foremost in our mind, how this is resolved. The public buy-in will have a lot to do with how thorough they feel that we've vetted the different options. And so
we respect that and are very sensitive to blow-ups on that.
Thank you. And finally, I'm going to let this be at your discretion. The moment may have passed. There have been a couple of things that you would have liked to have responded to in this hearing, and you were not given that opportunity. If the moment's passed, that's fine, but I did want to give you that. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva. Secretary Bernhardt, I appreciated the chance to meet you in my office earlier this month. I'm pleased you joined the committee for a public hearing. During our meeting, we discussed a number of issues from offshore drilling to renewable energy on public lands to climate science. We discussed the myriad of actions this administration has taken that impact our land and water. I came into our meeting, as I think you know, troubled by some of your department's handling of important environmental issues. And our discussion, while it was productive, didn't fully alleviate those concerns. After our meeting, I sent you a letter outlining several remaining questions that I had from our conversation, again urging you to remove California from future offshore drilling plans. I requested a response to my inquiry by this past Monday, but unfortunately you have not yet responded. Mr. Chairman, without objection, I'd like to enter this letter, the letter that I sent Mr. Bernhardt, into the record and request a written response from the Secretary. With that, I'll turn to my questions. Mr. Secretary, in our meeting, you seem to indicate that you don't believe Congress has directed you to address the impacts of climate change, but federal courts have held on numerous occasions that the Department must take consideration of future impacts into account, especially those related to climate change under the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act, among many others. This means that courts interpreting and relying on existing law say that you must consider climate change, and decisions made on the basis of the very real threat of climate change are valid. I'd also argue that a plain reading of the existing laws enacted by Congress squarely require you to manage for climate change in the natural resource planning process. Mr. Secretary, I'd appreciate a yes or no answer to the following questions. First, does the Federal Land Policy and Management Act require you to take, and I quote, into account the long-term needs of future generations, end quote, and I quote, take any action necessary to prevent unnecessary or undue degradation of those lands.
I think that's in the policy statement of the act.
So that'd be a yes?
Sure.
Again, yes or no? When it comes to the National Wildlife Refuge System, are you required by law to, quote, ensure that the biological integrity, diversity, and environmental health, end quote, of the refuge system, quote, are maintained for the benefit of present and future generations of Americans, end quote?
I think that's pretty consistent with the way it reads without looking at it.
So that's a yes. Third, yes or no? Are you required by law to ensure that national parks are, quote, unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations, end quote?
I believe that's what the Organic Act says.
Correct. Fourth, yes or no, is it true that the Secure Water Act of 2009 tasked the Secretary of the Interior with the responsibility, quote, A, to take the lead role in assessing risks to the water resources of the United States, including risks posed by global climate change, and B, to develop strategies to mitigate the potential impacts of climate change?
That act is one of 2 acts I know that have affirmative obligations related to climate change for the Secretary of the Interior.
So we're four for four, I believe. And finally, given these statements in law, yes or no, is there any doubt that you have a legal obligation to take into account the needs of future generations and manage the public lands to prevent unnecessary or undue degradation now and in the future?
We certainly have a need to take them into account. We are taking them into account.
Yet when we met, you claimed that Congress hasn't given you enough direction to address climate change.
That's not exact. What I specifically said is you haven't given me any direction to stop any particular activity. And if you want to stop it, you need to give us that direction. The reality is we are complying with NEPA. Our compliance
Mr. Bernhardt, Secretary, what type of direction would you want Congress to give you to make it any clearer?
Whatever you think you can do to stop it, if that's what you want to do, go for it. But that should happen in this body. That's not something the Department of the Interior does with a magic wand.
Well, Secretary, I've just given you a number of examples where you do have to take climate change into account to do your work. And we're talking about real people in communities here that are impacted in my district and districts all across the country. And we know, when you talk about a range, we know the range is from very bad to extremely bad. We're talking about long-term economic consequences, environmental consequences, and you're at the forefront of that. And we talk a lot about draining the swamp. It's the epitome of the swamp to have a handful of polluters dictate the environmental policies of this administration. You might wonder why there are people in swamp creature outfits behind you. The public has real concerns about your work, sir. And you've done very little to address those, and we're going to continue to hold you to account, Secretary. And with that, I'd be happy to yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. And I can tell by the comments that you've got a lot on your plate. And I just want to go on record and say, for those of us in Idaho, we appreciate you. We also want to take some of that stuff off of your plate. We'd be happy to take care of a little bit more of the things in our own backyard. But,
well, our plan is to keep our public land and manage it. So.
Good. All right. Well, we'd like to help you with that. And to that end, you had some personal involvement with the Sage-grouse plan in our state with stakeholders there and with the state and officials there and collaborated nicely to work out a plan where we could deal with local threats. I want to thank you for that. I am disappointed that it's being litigated now. And that actually leads to the question that I had. This was originally for budget discussions. Do you have any insight? Do you have any idea in terms of cost and or time that litigation adds to your typical budget?
Well, litigation is a constant at Interior, and so it's part of our world, and people are entitled to litigate. The it's a significant amount of time to deal with litigation, but it's part of what we're responsible for, and we take it as it comes.
Stakeholders in my state tell me that that's one of the #1 obstacles to making progress in how lands are managed, and just a positive improvement there.
You know, it's I think the real issue at times is that it just adds uncertainty after a policy decision is made. And then uncertainty then, affects planning. I will say that for sage-grouse, I think what has happened over the last 10 years has been really pretty amazing. When you look at all of these states have gotten together, they've come up with their own plans. The federal government is largely in alignment with their plans. And it doesn't matter whether it's Kate Brown in Oregon or your governor or others, the governors are all on board. And then you have a group that doesn't like it and they sue. And they're entitled to do that. But the particular group here in this case, they sued on the prior plan, which was done in the Obama administration, and they just amended their complaint to the new one. And so, and they'll have their day in court. But what it does do is maybe not give people a feeling of momentum to get on with the important work. And we've collectively, as a society, invested a great deal in the sage-grouse. Ag department, we spend about $73 million a year in the Department of the Interior. And this has gone on for decades, and I think it's done some really good things for the sage-grouse, and it's an amazing commitment by the state governors on trying to be responsible for a particular species. So they've done a lot of work, and then, the bottle gets shook up, but that's just the nature of our world today.
Just to that end, I want to make a pitch for a piece of legislation that Mr. Westerman has had in the past. I'm a sponsor of as well. The Resilient Forest has a pilot provision in there for an arbitration process. And that if someone does have a problem, then okay, bring a solution to the table. And that's, it's a fair request, I think. So I'm making a pitch.
That's an interesting idea. I'll look at the bill.
Making a pitch for that. So just to close things up from my standpoint, thank you for our new director, John Roos. We're excited about that, and appreciate anything else you can do to offer a little bit more flexibility within our state and more collaborative efforts like that. That's much appreciated. Understand you're an outdoorsman, and we would love to invite you to our state and show you some of the best hunting and fishing in the world.
Oh, I'd like to take you up on that.
All right. Well, with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for spending time with us this morning. During the 5 months I've been in office, I've met with over 300 Indian tribes and tribal organizations, and 90% of the time, the issue they raise the most is the lack of tribal consultation of the Department of Interior's tribal consultation prior to the Department of the Interior's reorganization, which caught many tribes by surprise. In the time since you've been sworn in, I have continued to hear about the lack of information provided to tribes on the reorganization's opt-out option. Secretary Bernhardt, you lead the federal agency with the most responsibility to Indian country. What happened during the reorganization was a clear breach of the Interior's policy to consult with tribes. I am a member of the Pueblo of Laguna, and I have worked with tribes my entire career. And I'm going to read you a definition of tribal consultation. And that is to ensure tribes have a strong voice in shaping federal policies that directly impact their ability to govern themselves. Do you agree with this definition?
I agree that that's potentially a definition.
Well, I hope you agree with it because that is your department's definition. So it seems that we're both in agreement that if the Interior makes a unilateral decision on a policy that impacts tribes in this country, then there's not been adequate tribal consultation?
Well, I think in reorganization in particular, tribes had an incredibly strong voice. They had such a strong voice that we decided that we would not include either the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the Bureau of Indian Education in the reorganization. So that was exactly what they asked for. And
that's interesting. That's very interesting. So perhaps the other 467 tribes that I haven't actually spoken to are the ones who agreed, because the 300 that I've talked to absolutely did not. This reorganization redraws the boundaries of departmental regions across the country, so I think it's reasonable to conclude that it impacts their governance, and it doesn't sound like they have a strong voice to shape this policy, at least not from my vantage point. I can confidently tell you that no tribal leader that I've talked to understands what the agency is doing. So perhaps it's a matter of communication that needs to be addressed. Due to this lack of clarity surrounding the details of the reorganization, and because you lead the federal agency with the most responsibility to Indian country, I would like to meet with you and your staff to discuss this issue to find some clarity for tribes, and I hope that you will.
That'd be great.
agree. Thank you very much. Thank you. In your role as secretary, you are charged to uphold the department's trust responsibility to foster a government-to-government relationship with tribes for this administration. As lead of the federal agency with the most responsibility to Indian country, what is your responsibility to carry out this duty when the head of the executive branch of government says, and I quote, and it seems like a day for tweets, so this is a tweet sent out by the president. If Elizabeth Warren, often referred to by me as Pocahontas, did this commercial from Bighorn or Wounded Knee instead of her kitchen with her husband, dressed in full Indian garb, it would have been a smash. And so essentially, I'm curious as to what your duty is when the head of your department seeks to not only alienate tribes, but essentially discount our history, make mockery of mass graves in our country, because we know that this country is founded on genocide of Indians. So what is your duty with respect to all of that?
I have a great regard for the culture and history of Native Americans and Alaskans throughout our country. I applaud their service in our services, and I have spent many years working on issues with Indian country in various capacities. And even during my Senate confirmation, our tribes submitted letters of support. I will carry out my duties faithfully.
Thank you. It looks as though I am out of time, and I yield back. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I'd like to commend you, Mr. Secretary, for doing a wonderful job. During your tenure at DOI, you worked diligently to increase hunting and fishing access, to ensure clean water for future generations, and to empower local decision makers. That's a remarkable accomplishment so far. Now, I've often told people I wish other agencies were running as smoothly as yours. Now, just imagine what we could have gotten done if my colleagues on the other side would have cooperated instead of degrading. I'd also like to apologize for what you're being put under instead of looking at the budget. So with that. Now, once again, the Democrats on the committee, as well as my other committee, aren't being transparent about their real agenda today. Once again, the Democrats on the committee failed to produce a public hearing notice memo in violation of their own committee rules, so the media and the American people know what is supposed to be on and to be occur today. Once again, Democrats want to talk about anything other than the point of the hearing, which is supposed to be about the excellent budget that you have proposed. I've always said, and I've been very consistent about this, whether it's been this administration or my side of the aisle, their side of the aisle. Good process builds good policy, builds good politics. It's that simple. This hearing should really be called, let's see how we can tear down a good man. So with that, I'll start my questions. Myself and numerous members of the committee support the administration's proposed reorganization and moving some operations out west. I have an appropriations submission letter here signed by 16 members and my colleagues that supports the DOI's reorganization. Mr. Chairman, I ask permission for this to be submitted to the record. The only thing I would actually say is that with the reorganization of Arizona with California, let's make the center Arizona, make California come to Arizona. That would be a nice, maybe even Prescott. Mr. Secretary, government closest to the people works best. So can you quickly elaborate and why the department's organization is so important?
So I think the restructuring of the regional boundaries was a very significant thing because it will facilitate the department's senior executive service level regional managers collaborating and working together in a much more coordinated fashion. I think the fact that we had 49 different regional parameters for folks made the senior executives working together a little less jointed. And I really fundamentally believe that we have great senior managers, and with them working together with kind of a collective understanding of priorities, will really minimize cross-jurisdictional conflict. And the folks that deal with Interior, when they come in, the last thing they need is one agency wanting to go one way and one agency wanting to go the other, and no one really understanding where things are going to go. And so I think the reorganization will really help with that from a boundary adjustment. I do believe fundamentally that moving some more of our folks west has a very big benefit. First off, I think it's great for them for the how far a dollar goes in the west versus how far a dollar goes here. Second, I think it will save us substantial time and money in terms of travel costs. It will also save us substantial time and money in terms of real estate costs. And more importantly, in my opinion, having them near the lands that they manage has a meaningful benefit. If you're able to see what's going on and have a sense of it, I think that overall, that is a good perspective. And this isn't a new thought. In 1936, in the hearing where the secretary was begging for the creation of a deputy secretary, the committee said, well, we'll think about giving you an undersecretary, which is what they called the deputy at that time, but we want to know whether you guys are going to spend over half of your time in the West. And so there needs to be a core component here in DC, but there's no reason why folks can't be moved to West. So I'm excited about both of those things occurring. I am excited about us implementing the regional boundaries that have been delineated in a way that creates kind of a one decision at Interior. And I'm interested in the transfer of authority to the West.
I thank the gentleman, and for a letter in support of that forestry package I asked for submission. By the way, real quick question. More of your holdings are in the east or in the west for the department?
Oh, far more in the west.
Makes more sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Palatano?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for meeting with me a couple of weeks ago where we discussed several of the issues. And of most important to me was the proposed budget, the overall Water Smart project cut by 3%, Title 16 by 95%. As you are well aware, the West is facing a lot of drought. It's still not over in California, but will this cut impact farm cities and vulnerable communities? There's 464 million authorized projects and 513 backlog for wind eligible recycling projects. How can the administration justify? I'm asking for 500 million to be able to help the West prepare for drought. Then the Title 16 program limits federal funding of a project to 20%. The program is in line with the 2018 Trump infrastructure plan as it incentivizes overwhelming state and local participation. But why is the administration infrastructure plan advocating for expanding federal incentive program while drastically cutting incentive programs on Title 16?
I don't have I couldn't hear the question, and I apologize for that.
Well, why is the administration cutting 95% of my budget on Title 16 when we know we have a problem?
So we have to make tough choices with the budget, and we certainly recognize there's a value to Title 16 funding. I think that the reclamation was primarily focused on its operational side of the house, and so they did make some tough choices.
Well, it's surprising that they don't understand this is also economic choices. I would like to be sure that we voice a very strong opposition to the budget cuts. I yield the further of my time to Mr.
I think they're doing energy and water today, so.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Secretary, Have you directed the reinitiation of consultation for CVP operations to include Old and Middle River storm flexibility provisions like those in the WIN Act?
I'm not sure that's part of the long-term operations or not. I honestly.
Have you given any direction?
I'd have to go back and look.
All right.
I mean, I'm happy to answer it. I just
Well,
don't know.
please do provide us with whatever you have on any direction you've given in that regard, and I'm hearing you commit to do that. Is that correct?
I certainly will get back to you with an answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. There was some unusual accounting that the IG criticized, where the federal government picked up the tab for studies that benefited the Westlands Water District, cost federal taxpayers improperly, and the GAO is now investigating this accounting scheme. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Chairman Grijalva and I wrote to you a couple of months ago because we were told you were not providing information the GAO requested. Can you commit to directing Interior staff to cooperate with the GAO on this matter that would appear to redound to the benefit of your former client?
Well,
that's a yes or no. Will you commit?
Actually, a congressman, it's not a yes or no. I'll check with ethics and I'll decide if I can make that direction, give that direction or not.
All right,
I honestly
very
don't
good.
know that.
Mr. Secretary, I wish I had more time to go into your calendars. We know your public calendars are either missing information about meetings or they refer generically to internal meetings or briefings where when we piece the details together from emails we've received, we see they actually involved parties and subjects that directly implicate former clients of yours, some.
I don't think that's accurate at all.
It's absolutely accurate, but here's the point. I want to give you a chance in the remaining time we have to assure the American people that you're not just doing the bidding of your former clients. So give us some examples where one of your former clients from the oil and gas industry or Westlands or another former client has asked for something specific and you've had to say no because it just wasn't in the public interest. This is your chance to show the public that you're not just doing the bidding of your former clients. You have the balance of my time.
Let me be very clear. My former clients aren't meeting with me. I haven't met with my former clients except potentially in a very large group.
Can you give us any examples where you've said no to specific requests?
We've said no significantly to requests from energy entities. We've said no to
specific
requests
examples?
for water allocations. We've said no to numerous things.
Water allocations are formula-driven. I'd like to know a specific policy request of a former client where you said no because it wasn't in the public interest, and I'm not hearing any examples.
That's completely inflammatory and wrong.
It's a pretty important subject.
There's a significant requests were made in the well control rule. There are numerous places where we didn't agree with the industry's recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the absence of the chairman, I'm told that I should recognize Mr. Gohmert for the next round of questioning. So,
well, thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman. Secretary, you reacted with respect to the characterization of your calendar. Is there something else you would like to say about your calendar?
Yeah, so the reality is if you go on to our DOI website, you can see every single pocket card I've ever had. You can see my calendar. You can see my private calendar. It's all available. And on top of that, since I've been at least for the last several months, I've published every single meeting I've had with an external third party. So those are published on a regular basis separately. So you can see my calendar, you can see my pocket cards, you can request my briefing book, you can request my the meeting requests that people send. You have 26,000 pages of material related to my calendar in this committee.
Thank you. And I know you didn't start out 2 years ago in the position you're currently acting, but experiences I've had here in Washington, different groups that got permits for the mall and other areas, let me just tell you, if it's a Christian group, they have met with a great deal of hostility, last-minute changes, charges anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 at the last moment. And on one occasion, it was a huge crowd, probably 200,000 or so. The last minute, well, they made them put fencing around that area of the mall. They, at the last minute, restricted them to one entrance, which meant people were going to stand in line in the summer for hours. So the Park Service officials, and I spent a great deal of time talking to them, and in the command module, the people I was dealing with had not made the decisions, but it was clear that, to me, that there was a great deal of harassment and setting up events for failure, actions by the officials of the National Park Service, which caused heat prostration that didn't need to be, forced them to line up in areas where there was no shade. So anyway, I just alert you to that and ask you to keep a watch on it. I know you've already had discussions about, and we do appreciate that you didn't spend government money to shut down open-air, private or public sidewalks like World War II. I was brokenhearted for the people at Martin Luther King Memorial. I mean, that's a really moving memorial, the way his statue is there coming out of the rock. And yet people were around the barricades wondering, this is our trip, and the Park Service decided to make it difficult. On one good note, though, after I cut the tape and moved the barricade at the World War II Memorial, got the help of Steve Palazzo, and we got the veterans in there because they weren't supposed to spend money to close a facility that didn't cost anything to keep open. Three of us decided to go check the Iwo Jima Memorial. That's under the Park Service, isn't it? Yeah. And when we got up there, sure enough, there'd been a barricade put up there, but there was like 3 buses up at the memorial. One of them had a bus of mainly people that fought at Iwo Jima, and when I went up there and I said I was impressed, you guys just ran over the barricade. And these elderly gentlemen said, we told the bus driver we didn't let the enemy keep us from the top of Sarabachi, and we wasn't going to let some little wooden stick keep us from getting up here to our memorial. So there are people out there that appreciate that you keep those things accessible. But one of my big concerns, there's stories here, 4,000% up for illegal immigration arrests on public or federal property. And I know Brian Terry was killed on Oregon Pipe Park. Are you able to do anything? I know your budget's limited, but at least you have a budget, unlike Congress. So what are you able to do with what you got?
This week is Police Week, and one of the things that we do during Police Week is we have a memorial service for fallen officers of the Department of the Interior. And yesterday, one of the parents that I met with, son was killed down on the boundary. He was a park ranger. He was killed in 2002, and their request to me was to make sure that we do not, for a minute, let up on our investment in training, survival training, and preparing the folks that we put down there. And I think that we certainly will not let up, but that is a real thing, that when we put people down there, we got to make sure they're well trained.
Thank you, Secretary. And that was Chris Eagle.
Yeah, that was Chris Eagle, that's right.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Thank the gentleman, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today and your testimony. The National Park Service owns and maintains a number of parkways that are part of the National Register of Historic Places. 4 of them in the National Capital Region. You're probably familiar with Rock Creek and Potomac Parkway, George Washington Memorial Parkway. There are 2 in my district. One is Suitland Parkway, and the other is at Baltimore Washington Parkway. Many of them, and certainly the VW Parkway, serves as a very important regional artery. 120,000 commuters a day, many from my district, others from around the region rely on it to commute back and forth to work, school, et cetera. Unfortunately, years of the department's neglect has made the BW Parkway one of the most dangerous and congested parkways in the region. In fact, according to the Volpe Center at the U.S. Department of Transportation, no capacity improvements have been made to the BW Parkway since its construction in 1954. At the beginning of March of this year, in lieu of a meaningful maintenance work and rehabilitation, the National Park Service simply lowered the speed limit by 15 miles per hour, which doesn't address the maintenance issues, but certainly raises the aggravation level for commuters. And only after sustained pressure from the Maryland congressional delegation did some patchwork maintenance get done, about 60 tons of asphalt. So my question, Mr. Secretary, does the Park Service have sufficient funds to maintain the BW Parkway and the other parkways on this National Register of Historic Places?
Well, I think if you look at our maintenance backlog budget, almost half of it is road maintenance. And, you know, we have challenges on GW Parkway, we have challenges on Suitland. I mean, to be very honest, those areas have been, you know, that maintenance has been deferred a very long time, and it creates.
Do you know whether it's in the president's budget to increase funding for those parkways?
Well, I think we're trying to work on that through the infrastructure. We have an infrastructure improvement plan as part of our budget to deal with that. So that was the way we tried to deal with that.
And let me just suggest this. I don't think it's a question of ownership. I know there's been conversations with the governor of Maryland whether to convey that to the state of Maryland. I don't think it's a question of ownership. I think it's a question of whoever does own it should fulfill the responsibility to maintain it, particularly in a safe condition. And I would suggest that if ownership transfer is contemplated, then it certainly address issues like, the impact on the environment, whether tolling that road makes sense for commuters on that roadway. And I would hope that the National Park Service retain that property.
I would think that it would largely have to come back to your committee here.
Yeah.
So you would get away in on all those things.
All right. Well, let me ask you though, what are your thoughts though about transferring these difficult and expensive parkways?
You know, we generally take the position as an administration that we're not terribly interested in transferring public lands out of the public estate. So that would be a big discussion for us.
And as you probably also know, Oxen Cove, 400-plus acre land in the shadows of the nation's capital in Maryland, in my district. Your predecessor had signed an MOU with Governor Hogan to transfer that.
So I think they're looking at exploring, I think it's more of like a letter of intent, looking at exploring different ideas.
And now that you're the secretary, and given what you just said, would that be your intent to pursue
Well, I'd have to look
transfer?
at it and make a decision. I'd have to get back to you on that.
So has your office had recently, since your predecessor left, has your office had conversations with Governor Hogan's team?
Not to my knowledge, but.
Okay. And again, there I would suggest there's very few acres. I envy my colleagues in this committee that talk about tens of thousands of acres of undeveloped land that is used for the public use and enjoyment. We don't have a whole lot in Maryland, but we do have about 400, 500 at Oxen Cove. It's the home to bald eagles. There's a lot of environmentally sensitive areas. So I would hope that your comment here today that you're not a fan, and I'm paraphrasing, of transferring public lands for private sector development. I just added that piece. I hope that holds true for Oxen Cove as well. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Stop certain time of 1:30, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Secretary?
Whatever we agreed to.
Okay. And votes are going to be called at 1:15, so my urging is to get to the questions, and we'll go from there and try to make sure that everybody that's present has an opportunity to ask. Mr. San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. Thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you also for making time to visit me in my office and have a dialogue about some of the concerns we're facing on Guam. I thought it was very constructive, and I think that we shared some good ideas. And I wanted to speak specifically about a budgetary concern that I think is something that relates to the conversation that we had when you met with me in my office. And this is with respect to the Compacts of Free Association, and most specifically the compact impact funding that's provided as a result of the Compacts of Free Association. Recently, the Department of Interior published the recent counts of compact migrants, and I'm going to reference those numbers with respect to Guam's count and with respect to Hawaii's counts. And I'm going to reference the amounts that were provided relative to those counts and have a discussion about how those figures correlate, but more specifically how there are certain elements that I think are not being properly accounted for. On Guam, the most recent count of compact migrants was about 18,874 based on the report. The funding levels that were provided as a result of the compact impact was $16,835,958 for an average per migrant amount of $892 per migrant. For Hawaii, the compact migrant count was 16,680. The dollar figure provided was $14,880,034, and that was also for an average migrant amount of $892. And so Guam and Hawaii are both receiving the same amount of compact impact in order to assist the local governments in handling the costs associated with hosting compact migrants as a result of the Treaty of the Compact of Free Association. However, there is one very distinct difference between Hawaii and Guam with respect to compact migrant costs, and that is the earned income tax credit. The earned income tax credit in Hawaii is actually funded by the U.S. Treasury, and so any compact migrant who qualifies for the earned income tax credit in their income tax filing, that's actually money that comes into Hawaii from the U.S. Treasury. On Guam, Guam has been absorbing the earned income tax credit liability since 2008. And so any migrant worker, as a result of the treaty, that's receiving the earned income tax credit is actually drawing those funds down from the Guam coffers. And so the $892 that's provided per migrant for Guam and for Hawaii, I'm assuming is formulaically based as determined by the department. But if that formula is also factoring in the economic contribution of the migrant worker, then the earned income tax credit liability of those migrant workers also needs to be factored in. And I don't think that that's something that this government has really paid attention to. When I brought this issue to the attention of your colleague, Mr. Mnuchin, during some questions I was asking him in my role in the Financial Services Committee, he was also taken by surprise with respect to that. And so the question that I had for you, Mr. Secretary, is are you aware of whether or not the earned income tax credit liabilities are being factored into the formula for the determination of compact impact?
So you raised this issue with me last week or the week before, and I don't have a good answer for you, but I am more than willing to either figure out if it should appropriately be factored in or if we need to work with Treasury on it. So I don't want to get into a question about the allocation of funds between two representatives, but it seems like an anomaly that maybe it's just not been thought of. Right. But we'll look into it and get to the bottom of that.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Yeah, formula notwithstanding, I think that my colleague from Hawaii will also agree with me that those formulas need to be reconsidered. Even just the cost of educating an individual, at least in my district, is $6,500 per pupil, and the $892 per migrant is just very grossly insufficient. As a matter of fact, based on a per capita basis, 18,874 migrants represents over 10% of the population of Guam, and yet the compact impact that's provided is less than 2%. And so there's a gross disparity with respect to that, and I think those formulas need to be revisited. But formulas notwithstanding, I'd like to specifically request for your assistance in setting up meetings with Secretary Mnuchin so that we can get to the bottom of this EITC question, because it's a serious liability for the people of Guam and we really need to resolve it.
I will promise that we'll work with you and work with Treasury. I can't promise that we'll get the Secretary of the Treasury, but we'll get somebody.
All right.
That's a commitment I'll make you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for acknowledging my existence. Mr. Bernhardt, thank you for being here, and I appreciate your testimony. I apologize, I was in another hearing and I missed some of the opening here. But you may be surprised, I'm actually going to heap on to what Mr. Huffman has largely been doing for this whole hearing. I am also very frustrated by the lack of responsiveness from the Department of Interior. I have contacted the Secretary. I asked directly for our office to be provided the analysis from the Government Performance Results Modernization Act in regard to offshore energy revenue sharing so we can restore our coasts and our wetlands in Louisiana. Because in the budget justification documents, it explicitly said that was why those funds were cut or rescinded. I asked for that, got nothing back. I asked for a phone call, I got nothing back. I asked for a meeting with the director of BSEE. The entire Louisiana delegation asked for a meeting with the director of BSEE, and we got nothing back, nothing. And it's really frustrating because it's very difficult for us to do our job when that happens. Oh, but wait, let me make note, that all happened during the Obama administration. During the Obama administration. Those requests were made nearly 4 years ago for the Government Performance Results Modernization Act. Still got nothing back. Mr. Secretary and everybody here, everybody knows what this is. This is the silliness that goes on with the parties where people make unreasonable requests and then they bang desk and gavels and other things when they don't get answers back. Except for in our case, I actually think we asked for pretty reasonable stuff. They specifically cited in budget justification documents why they were cutting a program that they had rated, they supposedly had rated, R-A-T-E-D, rated it, and found that it had poor outcomes. The only problem is that the program hadn't actually started yet, so I'm not real sure what they were rating, and I think that's why we never got anything back. In regard to Director Salerno, we asked for a meeting to talk about the well control rule. He refused to have a meeting. He refused to meet with the entire delegation. It was ridiculous, the lack of accessibility. Let me ask you a question about well control rule. Being from the state that represents more offshore energy production than any other state, in fact, more than all of the other states combined, and my old job of helping to restore our coast and sustain our wetlands, I care very much about that. Let me ask you a question. In regard to the revisions for well control rule, is there a single change in there that is now out of compliance with the recommendations that were made by the various independent boards that informed the changes?
Not a single one.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, let me ask you another question. Variances or alternative compliance is an issue that's come up here, meaning a company requesting alternative compliance with the regulations. Has this administration or has the previous administration granted more variances or alternative compliance? Are you aware of those numbers?
So it's my understanding that the numbers would be that the prior administration was actually higher.
I believe that's my understanding as well. Thank you. In regard to the number of seismic testing in the offshore, do you know if it's this administration or the Obama administration that granted more permits or approvals to do the 3D seismic?
Well, I suspect it's the prior administration.
And I believe that based on my evaluation, it was as well. Mr. Secretary, I'm not sure if you're aware, there was an Inspector General report from the Department of Interior that found that that an Interior official had effectively awarded about $325,000 to a wildlife program that a family member was the independent contractor on that program. Really looks awful, and that type of behavior cannot be tolerated. Are you aware of anyone on the other side of the aisle that has expressed concern to you about that?
Not with that specific issue, no.
And that happened during your administration, this administration, or the previous one?
Both. We have things happening every day. We had a
So this one specifically in the Inspector General report was an Obama administration official. Yeah. So, Mr. Secretary, I just making note of the silliness of what happens in this committee sometimes. Last thing is sitting behind you. I'm sure no one's noticed yet, but there's actually someone wearing a mask. Actually, a couple of y'all. Hey, look at that. Welcome. You know, it's ironic because they're saying fund LWCF, Land and Water Conservation Fund, when the reality is you're swamp creatures. And Land and Water Conservation Fund can't be used for swamps. We've actually been working to restore our swamps in Louisiana because that's where the money comes from. Every penny of it comes from the coast of Louisiana and the other producing states, but we're prohibited from using it for that purpose. So there's some irony in the friends back there behind you. But thank you all very much for being here, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for your testimony.
Just for the record, I think
They're not swamps?
I think you guys are speaking about two entirely different swamps. And with Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Bernhardt, I would like to discuss some recent decisions the Interior made regarding dangerous pesticides, including chlorpyrifos. The Fish and Wildlife Service has been working on a risk assessment of chlorpyrifos along with other neurotoxic pesticides and their adverse impacts on endangered species for several years. Before your appointment, this biological opinion was nearly completed and would have been released for public comment in 2017. According to Interior Department documents, however, you personally convened a series of meetings that changed the opinion. The New York Times reported that as a result of your intervention, the opinion will be delayed for 2 years and will use a new standard that benefits the chemical industry. So I have 3 questions, sir. Were you aware of industry opposition to the release of the biological opinion when you made your decision?
The industry views did not factor in at all to the decision I made. The decision I made is I read the document and I said,
No, just tell me,
who's-
you answer my question. Did you or your staff discuss your decision with anyone in the White House?
I don't recall doing that.
You don't recall. Will you release the draft biological opinions that the committee has requested?
Well, we'll work with the committee to see what kind of reasonable accommodation we can find.
So you're open to release?
Well, deliberative documents, there's a long history between these committees and deliberative documents.
So, sir, do you understand how cynical people are about decisions made under your leadership, given your previous lobbying work with, for Dow, the maker of these pesticides, and who opposed the ban that the Interior reversed?
I never represented Dow in any way, shape, or form. That's
You did not? So I guess the New York Times and other people are wrong. But also, there is this cynicism because President Trump received a $1 million contribution from the Dow AgroSciences, a company that opposed this pesticide that was against the ban.
Well, I can assure you that I read the documents and no one else did.
So there is a lot of skepticism and cynicism regarding decisions that are made because of your lobbying work. And so I encourage you to release the documents so that the committee can fulfill our constitutional responsibility of determining whether or not it was a rational decision that was made without any type of motivation. Mr. Bernhardt, in August of 2018, the Trump administration reversed a 2014 ban on the use of neonicotinoids, pesticides, on national wildlife refuge. This decision contradicts scientific research that has linked this class of pesticides to harmful effects on migratory birds, bees, and other pollinators. Over the duration of your tenure at Interior, your agency has consistently made decision after decision that benefits your former clients while showing little to no transparency. Is it realistic for the American people to believe that decisions you made in the dark with no oversight, because you're not providing the information and the documents that we are requesting, that benefit corporation you previously worked for is coincidental?
I think we've provided 66,000 pages.
Well, we saw the kind of documents that you provided. Some were duplicates and other papers didn't have any type of information. I just would like to share with you that I introduced legislation to ban chloropyrifos, and it's HR 230. It has 105 co-sponsors, and more than 10 committee chairmen are supporting my legislation, and over 130 organizations nationwide are in support of such legislation. And by the way, next week I'll be introducing legislation to reinstate this ban on neonicotinoid pesticides on national wildlife refuges. And I'm pleased that Chairman Grijalva and WOW Subcommittee Chairman Hoffman are co-sponsor of my bill. And it's a bipartisan bill. It will be a bipartisan bill because Republican member Radewagon is in support of such legislation. We have seen actions in New York, Hawaii, and California state legislatures to reinstate the ban in those states. I guess that they know something that you don't in terms of how harmful it is.
Thank you. Mr. Van Drew?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our hearing. Sorry we couldn't. I know we kept trying to get together, and you had a meeting, and then I had a meeting, and then we were, but I would still look forward to doing that and having a good conversation with you, and I appreciate you being here today. Let me just say I represent southern New Jersey, and specifically the 2nd Congressional District. It encompasses more than...
You have Cape May?
Yes, I do.
I love Cape May.
Cape May is a beautiful place. I spend a good amount of my time here trying to convince people to go there. People have a preconceived notion of New Jersey, and I don't think they have any idea what it really is about. It's a beautiful, beautiful area, and I'm glad you've been there. It encompasses my district, because it is rural and shore, 40% of the state and more than 60% actually of the coastline. And I'm going to keep my questions focused on one topic, which is the Coastal Barrier Resource Act, also known as COBRA. And before I begin, I just want to ask unanimous consent to enter a letter that I wrote to the Fish and Wildlife Service Acting Director into the record, if that is... Okay, thank you, Chairman. I also want to note, and maybe you could just check up on that, that I haven't received a response yet, and that was about 2 months ago, so maybe it got lost, if you could look. And it was purely based on a factual issue that we're really having in Stone Harbor, North Wildwood, in that area.
We'll find out.
Thank you very much. As you know, COBRA was enacted in the early 1980s to prohibit federal financial assistance for development on coastal barriers. The goals of COBRA are to minimize the loss of life and property, reduce wasteful expenditures, and protect our natural resources. And I think we all agree that these are worthy goals. In my district, we have a flood and coastal storm damage reduction project that was authorized by the Water Resources Development Act of 1999 called Townsend's Inlet to Cape May Inlet Shore Protection Project, which includes beach nourishment in the boroughs Avalon and Stone Harbor in Cape May County. And the project was known as the Stone Harbor Project, has used sand from a Hereford Inlet Borough area south of Stone Harbor that falls inside Coastal Barrier Resources System, unit number New Jersey 9. And if you want any of this information, again, we'll certainly, I know it's very technical. On 3 separate occasions, because of an exception, it was granted from Fish and Wildlife. So we were able to borrow from that area, use that sand for beach replenishment. In 2016, however, the service under the previous administration, this again was a previous administration actually, inexplicably reversed this exception and concluded that sand from Hereford Inlet could no longer be used for beach nourishment at Stone Harbor. The service's objection to the use of the Hereford Inlet borrow site resulted in sediment being taken from a more remote inlet called Townsend's Inlet and transported at additional price tag of $6.5 million, which the municipalities had to bear. Sediment surveys have also shown that there's simply not enough sand from Townsend's Inlet to nourish both the Avalon and the Stone Harbor portions of the project. In a perverse way, Cobra has the potential to have the opposite effects of its goal in this case. Secretary, do you agree that Fish and Wildlife granted an exception for the Stone Harbor project to use the Hereford Inlet borrow area with unit New Jersey number 9 for beach nourishment outside of the unit? The answer is yes. You know.
I honestly don't know.
Okay, I know, it is technical, but they have. And it's a very big, important issue down by us. COBRA prohibits all federal expenditures on units of the coastal barrier resource system, except for a few clearly defined exceptions, which are found in Section 6 of the statute. I have a letter dated December 24th, 96, from the Fish and Wildlife Service Regional Director named Ronald Lambertson to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Kaiser of the U.S. Army Corps, which states that it is the service's conclusion that this proposed action does constitute an exception under Section 6 of COBRA, provided that the following conditions are incorporated into the project design. During the planning phase of this project, the U.S. Army Corps coordinated with the service and received additional approval. The project met those conditions, and without this project, Stone Harbor Point may not have existed today because it was experiencing severe erosion and habitat loss due to the lack of littoral drift, which essentially recycles sand back to the unit. The Army Corps never placed sand directly on Stone Harbor Point. That habitat grew through natural processes of sand re-nourishing Stone Harbor's beach down south to the area. So I have another letter that I ask unanimous consent to put into the record, and that was that last record, Mr. Chairman. And I'll ask you the previous question. Do you agree that Fish and Wildlife Service granted an exception? And when you do research, you'll find that they did. And so I guess the whole point of this is that they had granted research, an exception in the past to do this. We're doing no environmental harm. In fact, it's environmental good, but we seem to be hitting a stone because Fish and Wildlife Service, and we really need your help and would like our office directly to interact with yours because we're causing more harm by what we're doing now.
So we'll work with you on it.
I did.
We'll absolutely work with you on it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today and for meeting with our office a few weeks ago. Thanks for putting some time aside.
And I think we got you some follow-up information on that.
We got that yesterday. We still have a few more questions, though.
Sure.
And before I begin, I'd like to submit a letter for the record, ask for unanimous consent. This is a letter from Governor Henry McMaster, essentially stating his opposition to seismic air gun blasting and offshore drilling off the coast of South Carolina. And I submit that for the record. I assume, Mr. Secretary, that your office would take that in consideration when producing the next leasing plan, correct?
The letter?
A governor's support of banning offshore drilling?
Absolutely, it's a factor.
All right. And you all would take into consideration local mayors as well?
We've talked about that, absolutely.
Okay, that's good to know then. And in late March, District Court found that President Trump's attempt to undo offshore drilling protections in the Arctic and portions of the Atlantic was illegal. And then recently, you said you put the new 2019 to 2024 leasing plan, the one that included the entire Atlantic coast, on hold. Last week, I believe you said you're weighing your options, that you could proceed as if the case was decided incorrectly or as if it didn't exist. So I just want to be clear here today. There's no legal impediment to stop your office from developing the leasing plan, correct?
Well, I think there's no legal impediment to developing a leasing plan. There is a question about what the scope of that particular plan could be and what it could contain when you got to the point of finalization. So that's really the answer.
So there's no legal impediment to developing that plan Is there a political one?
Well, there's not a political one from a politics point of view. Where we are with this plan is the draft proposed program was developed and went out for public comment, as you know. Got a lot of comment. BOEM had been working on it. We have this decision, and my looking at the decision is asking the following things. One, does it make sense to move forward now or wait and see how the
Okay, I don't mean to, Mr. Secretary, I apologize. I don't mean to interrupt you. I don't have a lot of time. So my understanding, there's not a legal impediment to moving forward right now, is what you
Well, there's a
testified
legal
to.
impediment to moving forward in a particular way that leads to a particular outcome. There is. I mean, the district court has laid out a paradigm that I fully suspect the Department of Justice will want to challenge, and I'll be trying to develop a plan while that's going on, and then the court will ultimately rule, and then I would have to deal with that, and if I guessed wrong. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do.
So you don't want to have to go back and recorrect the leasing plan if the court finds it in violation, is that correct?
So I think that might be not a wise use of resources.
Right, okay, all right. And you're solicitor of the Department of the Interior at the end of the Bush administration, correct?
Correct.
And just before leaving office, the department put out a proposed 2010 to 2015 plan that includes sales in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, even though that area was blocked off by statute, correct?
That was a proposed plan, a draft proposed program.
Okay, so that was a proposed plan in violation of that statute, but in this case it's different, correct?
What's different is I have until 2022 to get a new plan in place. I have some time, and so I'm going to figure out what I'm going to do, and then I'll do it.
And you've had direct communications with the President and the White House about this, whether or not to move forward with the leasing plan or wait?
Well, I certainly have informed the White House that I'm in pause, and I'm consulting with the Department of Justice.
And what's been the President's response to that?
Well, I've not been told that I had to go any different direction.
Okay. And moving to seismic, you mentioned when we spoke that there's no connection legally between the leasing plan and the seismic air gun blasting.
I think that's right as a matter of law.
Okay, and your office is still processing seismic permits for the Atlantic Ocean right now, correct?
Well, actually, I think BOEM is processing.
Right.
And so I think we gave you some documentation that shows that I think we have up to 9 permits in various stages of processing.
And while you're saying they're independent of each other, I believe your Assistant Secretary, Joe Bailash, said to an industry gathering, quote, "I will tell you, we wouldn't work really hard to get the seismic permits out if it was an area that wasn't going to be available." So it sounds to me like they are directly involved.
Let me be very clear about that. I have a lot of respect for Joe Bailash, but this is my decision.
All right, so you disagree with him there. That's good to know. And here's what I'm worried about. You have the next step of the plan, which has South Carolina and Florida directly in its crosshairs. And I think that this administration and your office recognizes it as electoral poison to put those on the map before the 2020 election. And the court case in the Arctic is a convenient excuse to wait until that election passes, but the people of South Carolina aren't going to be fooled by this. It's clear you have your marching orders. I have mine from the constituents in South Carolina. And that's why we've introduced H.R. 1941 to ban offshore drilling off the Atlantic and off the Pacific coast to make sure there are never any oil spills off our coastline. And that's what we're intention to do. I would yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Secretary Bernhardt. Excuse me. I wanted to ask you off the bat about working with my office to maximize the potential for increasing permits for renewables on public lands and seeing how we can facilitate more renewable energy projects. Will you work with my office on that?
Sure. I think for BLM the last 2 years we have 15 applications for renewable projects.
I can't hear you.
Yes, sir. Happy to work with you.
All right, good. So I was reading the newspaper this week, and it hit the headlines that 2 days ago that carbon dioxide levels hit 415 parts per million, which is the highest in human history, the highest in 800,000 years. Did you happen to see that, Secretary?
I didn't see that particular fact.
That was on the front page of USA Today, and I'll ask unanimous consent that the article titled "Carbon Dioxide Levels Hit Landmark at 415 Parts per Million, Highest in Human History" be made part of the record. And that was, of course, when there were no humans the last time it hit that kind of level. And so my question for you is, on a scale, and this is a number question, I'm looking for a number, Secretary. On a scale of 1 to 10, how concerned are you about that?
Well, what I will say is I believe that the United States is
and
number
10 being
one.
the most concerned and
I
1 being
believe
the
that
least
I
concerned.
believe
What's
the
your number, Secretary?
I believe the United States is number 1 in terms of decreasing CO2.
Did you hear me all right,
emissions
Secretary?
amongst
I'm asking you, what's
developing
your
countries.
number of your level of concern about that on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most concerned? What's your number for how concerned you are about us hitting 415 parts per million of carbon dioxide?
I haven't lost any sleep over it.
Okay, so you're a 0 or a 1, is that it? Well, let me ask you this. One of your clients...
We are number one. We are number 1 in terms of reductions amongst developing countries in CO2 emissions.
Well, one of your clients used to be the Independent Petroleum Association of America. Am I correct in that?
They were a client at one time.
Okay, and one of your clients used to be Halliburton Company, which is a very significant player in oil and gas, correct?
I have represented Halliburton.
Do you know what their level of concern on a scale of 1 to 10 would be about the carbon dioxide levels hitting the highest in human history?
I have no idea.
No idea. Okay. Well, I want to talk about coal for a second. Secretary Bernhardt, the administration claims to support an all-of-the-above energy strategy, but there really seems to be a preference for coal over renewables. In southern Nevada, the BLM terminated its resource management plan revision, which was supposed to be a way to designate more solar leasing areas. In Utah, the BLM has yet to hold an auction in a designated solar leasing area that was originally planned for September. At the national level, the agency dissolved the Renewable Energy Coordination Office. As a result, progress on wind and solar on public lands has nearly come to a halt. The proposed budget for renewable energy at the BLM is essentially flat, but despite decreasing demand for coal-fired power generation, you are requesting a 66% increase in funding for the coal program. Why is the administration proposing to spend more of our scarce taxpayer resources on an energy source for which demand is declining?
Well, I think that when I look at our budget and renewable numbers, here's what I see. Right now, BLM has about 127 renewable projects ongoing. Over the last 2 years, we've gotten 15 applications. Two solar projects have been approved. We're using about 122 staff on those various projects and applications. In our oil and gas operations, we get about 4,000 APDs a year. We have 96,000 wells. We have about 850.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but on that train of thought, we learned in an April 30 hearing held by this committee that investors are reluctant to apply for new renewable projects on public lands due to the lengthy and complicated permitting processes. So the question there is, what are you doing to address the barriers to siting new renewable projects on public lands? For example, what are you doing to facilitate programmatic reviews of renewable projects instead of time-consuming one-by-one permitting currently used?
So we've actually reduced our review time in DC from on average of 199 days for BLM projects to 29.
Yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for this important hearing. Mr. Secretary, I want to talk about 3 areas that I'd like to get to wildfires, probably won't have time to, but the topic dealing with Central Valley Project, water allocations, methods of predicting water availability and reasons for the challenges of meeting contractual obligations. 2, the importance of water infrastructure and using all the water tools in our water toolbox, which includes storage, conveyance, conservation, and innovation, and our national parks and the deferred maintenance, which is a real problem, I think. And all of this in light of climate change and sea level rising and a very complex water system in the West, especially in California, as you know, between the partnership of the state and federal water projects. Let's begin on the water allocations here. We have 176% snowpack this year. I mean, it's either feast or famine. We've been blessed with a good snowpack and rainfall. Matter of fact, they're even talking about snow this weekend in the high country. Yet, while large portions of the federal contractors have 100% allocation, the San Luis Water Unit is still stuck at 65%. In a year like this, if we can't increase, we understand on average or below on all the constraints on the system, but with the existing biological opinions, do you have any thoughts on this?
I know that Ernest, Brenda, and Tim are working hard on those issues.
So tomorrow you think I should focus that question to her?
Well, actually, it would be a better question focused to her. She's the one directly involved.
Okay.
I'm not.
Well, let me ask a broader question as it relates to storage and infrastructure. You and I have been involved in trying to solve water problems in the West and in California particularly for more years than I care to count, but for me it's 39 years. What do you think is achievable in the next 2 years? I think I had a good conversation with folks in Sacramento last week. You talked about your meeting with the governor. What do you think's possible?
So to be candid, I think we've had very, very good conversations with the governor and his team, and we at some point we all have to make measurable progress here, and some folks
and get past the politics of water and the finger pointing and the blame game, which just frustrates the hell out of me.
I know.
To be frank,
I know it does. And look, we're prepared to engage with the state. We're prepared to engage with you all, and move the ball forward. And it's not always the case that you have interests line up across administrations, and I'd like to see if we can get something done here.
well, I want to urge you to continue to work with the folks in California, because I think there are efforts that Senator Feinstein and I and others have been engaged in. I think there are bipartisan opportunities here if we get past the politics and the finger pointing and trying to paint people as villains, whether it be the San Joaquin Valley and agriculture or whether it be environmentalists. The fact of the matter is climate is changing, sea levels are rising, and we've got to determine how much agricultural land we want to keep in production in California, and how much we can deal with species that are being threatened from numerous sources, and that's the reality. Let's shift over. My time's quickly going. I can see the clock. National parks, deferred maintenance. How realistically are we going to provide fine, not just Yosemite and Kings Canyon, but throughout the country?
Well, our view really is to work with you all collectively to get behind some sort of maintenance backlog infrastructure fund, and we've proposed a proposal. We'd like to work with you on that or something like that.
What do you think the primary source of funding mechanism should be?
Well, we had our proposal is based on energy revenue. No, not only oil and gas revenue, but alternative energy revenue, and its prospective growth. There's probably a variety of ways to do it, but the reality is if we don't get something done, The maintenance backlog today is much worse than it was when we thought it was out of control when I left Interior the first time.
Mr. Chairman, I know my time's expired, but I would like you to provide a list for the committee's purposes of what Interior is doing to prioritize on how you tackle that deferred maintenance issue.
We can do that, Congressman. I get you some.
You did say it was a damn good bill, right?
A damn good bill, DAM.
There you go.
Afternoon, Mr. Secretary. I join my colleagues on the committee in thanking you for appearing here personally. I thank you for the time you spent in my office. We discussed a number of issues in my office to include tour helicopters overflying our national parks and destroying their ambience, and full implementation of the National Parks Air Tour Management Plan. We talked about the USS Arizona, a sacred site in Pearl Harbor, which has been closed for repairs, and talked about accelerating those repairs. We talked about the Japanese-American confinement site program in general, and Honouliuli, a confinement site, national memorial now, monument, I should say, in Hawaii that needs advancing. We talked about endangered species funding and disproportionate funding that does not fully recognize Hawaii's status as the endangered species capital of the world. So we appreciate all of those. I do want to follow up on one issue we discussed, which my colleague from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas, talked about, which is the Compact of Free Association and Compact Impact Aid. The first thing I would say is I completely agree and sympathize with his plight in terms of the earned income tax credit and the insufficiency of Compact Impact Aid to compensate Guam fully for the actual economic consequence of the Compact country residents. I certainly have a similar concern where essentially the healthcare funding goes through the roof because many of the Compact country folks come to Hawaii. Their healthcare needs are taken care of through our state Medicare program. These include folks from Guam because Hawaii is really the healthcare capital of the Pacific. Just as he views the Compact Aid as completely insufficient, so do I. We have calculated our healthcare costs alone at somewhere in the range of $100 million. And then if I follow his formula in terms of the cost of education, if you take the distribution per capita that he mentioned and apply it to our own cost of education per pupil, which is roughly double that of Guam, you come up with another $200 million. So pretty soon you're talking about some real money that is paid for by Hawaii, $300 million plus, for which we get somewhere in the range of $14 million of Compact Impact Aid. Now, we welcome the folks from the Compact countries coming to Hawaii. They've been an incredible contribution to our community, to our ohana, as we say, to our economy, and we look forward to that continuing. But we cannot absorb that level of economic consequence and continue to support the Compact overall. The Compact is a very, very strong initiative by our country, fulfilling historical trust obligations from the trust territories, and increasingly, as you and I discussed, it is a critical part of our overall national defense strategy, because certainly many other countries would like to basically get more involved with those countries, primarily China. Let me ask you this. It seems to me that fitting the Compact issues into the Department of the Interior to include Compact Impact Aid and to treat it as a continuing obligation from a trust perspective is trying to fit the shoes into the wrong box. And it seems to me that as we take a look at the big picture, and we're starting the renegotiations on the Compact right now with two of those three countries, we should be looking increasingly to our defense obligations as opposed to the Department of the Interior. And I just wanted to ask for your thoughts on that. Do you think that's a productive approach for us to start to take? I just see no way that Interior can be responsible, or that the Interior budget, for that matter, can support a consequence on Compact Impact Aid, which has really been good for our country, but not so good for Guam and Hawaii.
So I appreciate that question a lot. I don't have the authority to say where it should be in a budget, but I will tell you this, that those areas mean a lot to our country in a variety of ways, including our national security interests. And I do think that we are paying more and more attention than maybe was paid to those issues historically because of that. I mean, certainly we paid a lot of attention after World War II, but I think there may have been some variation of the intensity, and I think we have a better perspective. So I think it merits thinking about this outside of the box compared to a small office within the Department of the Interior.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I just think that as we go into this next round of negotiations and the related discussions on compact impact aid, Guam and Hawaii simply cannot afford to continue down the status quo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Always great to see a GW Colonial like myself, and thanks for visiting me at my office. We had talked a little bit about the National Offshore Drilling Plan, and as you know, there's unanimous bipartisan opposition to that happening in Florida. Can we expect to see offshore drilling off of Florida anytime soon?
Well, I think it's a while before we figure out our plan, and even in the most active scenario, soon for a development plan would be, years from now.
And is the administration going to consider the fact that we have united bipartisan opposition in determining whether we'd be in the plan?
I've been very clear with every member I've met with that it's my view that the state's input is a very important component of any final plan.
Now, as you know, the Department of Interior has primary oversight over Everglades restoration. We have the Herbert Hoover Dike around Lake Okeechobee, where we're restoring the Southern Reservoir. Again, these are major bipartisan supported issues. Last year, we got $139 million into the budget. In the 2020 budget, we saw an initial 31% cut, but now we're seeing there may be support for the $200 million we're requesting.
So I think the president actually submitted a budget amendment the night before last on that, and obviously the Appropriations Committee is meeting today.
So you could expect we have a much better shot at that now?
Well, I know that they made the request, so.
Okay. And then
it's in the Corps' budget, I believe.
Sure. So a lot of this is really important, as you know, because red tide can be exacerbated by nutrients coming out of Lake Okeechobee through St. Lucie and the Caloosahatchee River. So it's important for me that we have a commitment that, Department of Interior understands that that nutrient load could exacerbate red tide and that we need to continue to work on this
I can assure you that that fishery in the South is phenomenal. And we've done a lot collectively as a society on the Everglades, and there shouldn't be backsliding in any way, shape, or form. We do have significant issues with invasives, as you know, and so we have to be aggressive with them.
And we're going to get into that in a moment.
All right.
A bill that I'm working on that passed in a bipartisan manner last year was to make the Kissimmee River a wild and scenic river. Restoring the rest of that river is already in the new budget that President Trump put forward. Can we expect support from the Department of Interior to do a good faith study should the bill pass and potentially make it a wild and scenic river, since we spent $1 billion restoring it?
So, you gave me a draft of that language, and we'll work with you on that.
The other issue we're working on developing is with, in a bipartisan way, with Senator Rubio on reinstituting a Reef Protection Act. The Florida reef has been devastated over the years. We have a lot of pollution and population, and this would go at that and repropagation. If we could get a bipartisan bill together, would this be something that the Department of Interior would work with us on?
Yeah, I think that's something that we'd be very interested in working with you on.
With regard to species, obviously, first, the ones that are endangered, we saw a downlisting of the manatee, which is iconic in Florida, from endangered to threatened. With 804 deaths last year, that was a record. The population wildly shifts. We won't see any reduction from threatened anytime soon, would we, with regard to the manatee status?
I have no knowledge of a petition or something floating around. I would think that's incredibly unlikely.
Okay. And then with the Florida panther, that's a endangered species that we've seen people try to say it's not entitled to protection because it's not a subspecies, even though there's been overwhelming studies on it. There's no attempts right now to downgrade the Florida panther, would there be?
I'm not aware of any. I think we just did a recovery program.
Yeah. And lastly, what are some of the things that you all are working on to address the invasive species issue in Florida?
Well, I think we've been very aggressive on pythons, and I think there's some interest in being more aggressive on that. We're working very closely with the state wildlife agency, and I think the governor's interested in that as well. So I know that those, and we've had some novel techniques that have made news in terms of attracting larger female pythons to particular areas. So that's certainly a big issue for us.
Thanks. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for organizing today's hearing on the Department of Interior and its policy priorities for fiscal year 2020. I also want to thank Secretary Bernhardt for taking the time to testify. It's good to see you again. Today's oversight hearing is of the utmost importance. Prior to voting on the Interior and Environment Appropriations Bill, members of Congress must have assurance that federal funding will be spent in the best possible way according to the intentions of Congress. Currently, the Department of Interior is reorganizing its structure in an effort to streamline the efficiency and effectiveness of its respective agencies. While the Trump administration has often claimed it wants to streamline efficiency and increase effectiveness, these statements have in several cases translated to decreases in consultation, elimination of important programs, streamlining of environmental reviews, and federal employee hiring freezes. I hope, however, that under the Department of Interior's new leadership, we can work with you, Secretary Bernhardt, and ensure that the DOI keeps its promise to the American people and works to improve its services. As I shared with you when we met, my home state of Nevada, where we have more than 85% of land that is managed by the federal government, our dependence is really on our federal partnership. Mr. Bernhardt, as the threats from climate change increase in number and severity, Nevadans need assurance from the department that our state will continue to get the resource it needs, something the prior secretary failed to provide. As park visitation increases in our state, the administration has continued to propose full-time employee staff reductions. Deferred maintenance backlogs for the National Park Service now exceed $250 million in Nevada and more than $11 billion nationwide. The Tule Springs National Monument, which I helped designate in Congress more than 5 years ago with the support of the ranking member, still lacks a visitor center. I hope we can work collaboratively to find solutions to these shortcomings and that the DOI will make a promise to the American people that it will manage our lands according to the best interest of all Americans. So, Secretary, can you assure Nevadans and all Americans that you will respond to the needs of our constituents and promote scientifically backed management efforts?
Yeah, I don't believe there's a hiring freeze at all. I'll have to go back and look at that. In addition to that, I'm signing an order today that will allow superintendents to use FLORIA dollars for permanent staff under certain conditions. So if we have a real hiring problem out there, we'll get to the bottom of that. I'm just not aware of it.
Thank you for looking into that. The national park visitation increased by 14% while staffing, according to our...
And you know, that's a very legitimate point, and that is, it's my perspective that the Park Service spent a lot of time planning for its centennial, which was great. And they got folks to really show up, which was great. But they didn't spend a lot of time thinking operationally about that. And so we certainly have seen some challenges about that. I have a new director of operations, David Vela, who's working on that. But I think it's a legitimate point.
So the recreation economy on Nevada's land alone supports $4 billion in wages and salaries and 87,000 direct jobs. In the 2019 Conservation in the West poll, 81% of Nevadans surveyed believe that the recreation economy is important for the future of Nevada, and half of all respondents said that the ability to live and recreate on public lands is a significant reason we live in the West. So again, Secretary, what can you say to our constituents in Nevada's 4th to give us the confidence that you and the department under your leadership recognize climate impacts on public lands and have a plan to account for these changes to protect our recreational economy?
Well, we certainly feel strongly about the recreational opportunities on public land. I've issued an order that says that no land can be transferred, exchanged, or acquired without thinking through its benefits or loss of recreational access. We are committed to managing to ensure that recreationists have plentiful access to public land.
Thank you. And finally, what steps are you taking to help create additional clean, green jobs and reduce carbon pollution by expanding renewable energy development?
So despite the comments today, my view is that we are processing renewable applications when they come in, and I think that my data would support that understanding. There's no interest at all of prioritizing prioritizing traditional energy over renewable. That's simply not something I'm proposing.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. I'm sorry I've been in and out, but we, as you know, have multiple hearings going on at once. Now, your department makes land management decisions every day on, over the land that you supervise. Is that correct?
Certainly.
Yes. And in fact, you have the discretion to issue oil and gas leases on federal lands. Is that correct? When people apply for oil and gas leases, you can decide whether to grant them or not.
They go through a process.
Right, and you get to decide and you also decide the appropriate circumstances under which those leases should be granted, and you have the ability to decide how the drilling is going to proceed. Is that right?
Within the parameters of the law.
Right, so that answer's yes?
Well, the answer is it's
Yeah, you don't have, it's a pretty easy question. I'm not tricking you with that one. Okay. So, as Mr. Levin discussed with you many hours ago, it seems now, the laws, there are certain laws that require the department to take climate change into account when it's managing its land. Is that correct?
Certainly, NEPA would be one of those laws.
Right, NEPA would be one of them. And so Interior would have the ability to make choices that would be consistent with those goals. Is that correct?
Well, not to the exclusion of other.
Well, no, but when you're deciding land management, that's one of the criteria you take into account. Is that right?
Of course.
So I was a little bit perplexed when you said that to make land management decisions with climate change taken into account, that you needed direction from Congress. What direction exactly is this you think you need from Congress?
So the direction I think is if you all have a view on climate change that says don't develop energy on federal lands, that's fine. You have to go through a process of codifying that and providing that direction, and if you provide it, we'll certainly faithfully execute.
I understand that, but are you saying you don't have the authority to take that into account?
Just to say, from today forward, David Bernhardt says no development on federal lands. I absolutely do not have that authority.
Secretary,
you have that authority.
Mr. Secretary, nobody's asking you to do that. We're asking
That's exactly what we're talking about.
No, it's not. What we're asking you to do is to take climate change into effect when deciding these leases. Let me just give you a specific...
We already do.
Wait, excuse me. Let me just give you a specific example, and that is methane gas. Now, you have the ability to determine what kind of methane gas should be allowed from these oil and gas developments on federal lands. Is that correct?
Within certain boundaries.
Okay.
That is correct.
And would you agree that when methane gas is released into the atmosphere, it's a powerful global warming pollutant, which is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide in the short run?
I've heard that statistic before.
Okay. And are you aware this is scientifically settled, that statistic?
I don't know, but I'm not disputing the fact.
Well, okay, you're not disputing it. And so one of the reasons why your department repealed the BLM methane waste prevention rule was you said that states are doing enough to reduce methane waste. Is that right?
Well, certainly in your state is a leader in
Our state.
methane. My state, Colorado, has been a leader, and
But are the
familiar
other
with that.
states doing that too,
And,
sir?
well,
Are the
certainly
other
the
states
top
doing that too?
10 energy-producing states
Okay.
are. I would say that's
Now, are the state methane waste regulations as strong or stronger than the requirements of the 2016 BLM rule?
I don't know that for sure.
You don't know. And in fact, not all states where oil and gas development occurs on public land are as protective. It might be news to you, most states have much weaker rules that allow companies to vent and flare a higher percentage of gas and require less frequent leak detections and repairs. So do you think 1 billion cubic feet per day is a large amount of natural gas?
I honestly don't know.
You don't know. Well, 1 billion
A
cubic
billion
feet.
cubic feet a day of natural gas?
Uh-huh.
Significant, yeah.
Yeah, okay, because it's enough to power over 24,000 homes, so that seems like a lot. Now, if we would regulate that, if we would tax that, we could get a lot of money back into our coffers, wouldn't you agree?
It certainly would have a financial component.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
If any member wishes to ask additional questions, Mr. Huffman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, a moment ago, I believe I heard you testify that there was no effort to give preference to traditional or fossil fuel energy development over renewables. Did I hear you correctly?
That's certainly my view, that the effort should be to do both.
I was confused by that because during the government shutdown, we are told that work on renewable projects ground to a halt. We have evidence of at least one specific project where BOEM basically shut it down, canceled public meetings, announced that it would not reschedule them until the shutdown ended. But we know that for fossil fuel projects, you designated essential personnel and mandated that that work continue without interruption. Do you not regard that as a double standard?
Well, I can tell you specifically that we also directed folks to report for renewable projects. Certainly for one particular solar project I'm aware of, we put people back to work right away. My view with the
It certainly didn't appear
shutdown,
to be with that wind project. That
well,
didn't appear to be essential personnel.
So I think the issue is, I asked Boehm about that because when it came up in some of my interviews, and I was surprised by that. And their view was that the dollar amount associated there in terms of putting people back to work was low. My view
Well, I
at
also
the time,
note, if I
with all
could
due
reclaim my
respect-
time, Mr.
with all due
Secretary,
respect,
I'd love
like
more
to
information on that, but I have two more questions and very little time. I also note that BLM's budget request for renewable energy for 2020 is essentially flat, while the budget proposal for the BLM coal program is an increase of 60%. That does not exactly look like even-handed preference for these different energy sources. But back to a conversation we were having where I asked you for some examples where some of your former clients in the oil and gas industry had made specific policy requests and you had to tell them no because it wasn't in the public interest. And you brought up the well control rule as an example. I'm confused by that because that wasn't telling industry no by any stretch.
Actually, that's not
The petroleum industry, if you'll pardon the pun, was gushing with praise for your administration when you released this rule. It's going to save big oil $980 million over 10 years.
They wanted, I believe.
It references private copyrighted standards of the oil industry that for the public to even see the standards referenced in your rule, they have to sign up with the API website and pay a fee of $70. Really, is that an example of you pushing back on big oil?
I want to be clear here. I think I think if you look at the comments fairly, you'll see that they wanted more than what that rule gave. We rejected a
You didn't give
number of
them everything they wanted, but you saved them $980 million over 10 years, and they were lavishing you with praise in their characterization of the rule. I want to give you the rest of my time, though. Let's find a real example where one of your former
That is a
clients
real
asked
example.
a specific policy request and you had to say no.
That is a real example.
Because the other one you mentioned, the water allocations, we know that's formula-driven, and earlier in your testimony, you said Brenda Berman makes that call anyway. So I'm still waiting, and I'll give you the balance of my time to reassure the American people that you're capable of even-handed policymaking and pushing back on your former
Congressman,
clients.
I have absolutely no problem telling people no.
Let's hear
and
some
we have done
examples.
it. I just provided them to you, one to you.
A $980 million windfall to your former...
That's not a win.
clients.
That is
Really?
That is an unfair characterization.
All right.
They asked for more. They got less.
Clearly, we're not going to get any examples. So you testified when you were asked about your level of concern that this planet has hit 415 parts per million on carbon dioxide concentrations, the highest level since humans evolved. And you said you're not losing any sleep over that. Well, an overwhelming consensus of the world's climate scientists are losing sleep. It is a hair-on-fire crisis for them.
We
and I want to give you a chance to revise your statement because a lot of people are watching, and I think it's one of those clips of testimony that will reverberate. People will look back on what you said. So I want to just give you this chance to assure people that you actually get it on climate change.
So I appreciate that gracious gesture. The reality is that the America has the #1 reduction in CO2 amongst developing countries.
You keep
We're
bringing it
number
back
one.
to our reduction.
Number two.
The question
Number
was
two.
about, do you care about the concentration?
I absolutely care that
just
our
not losing
climate
any
is
sleep.
changing and that that we need to factor that into our thinking. I absolutely believe that, and I've said that over and over and over. That's the reality.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop.
Yeah, thank you. We're calling for votes now, so this may be the last chance we have to abuse you for this morning. But I'm certainly we'll have other opportunities in the near future as well. This is supposed to be about interior budget policy priorities. Can you just briefly go through some of the lines that you have increased in your budget lines that you have put priorities on for an increase?
So our biggest priority right now, sir, is trying to address the maintenance backlog. We would love help in doing that.
I appreciate that one. Let's go into that. I mean, we've talked about LWCF. Now, for someone like me who is concerned about increasing our maintenance responsibilities by adding to it, how would you respond to me as to what we can do to look at that maintenance backlog best?
Well, my thinking is that we really need to start with our facilities and trying to get them up to snuff.
How is LWCF funded?
It's funded in theory by Congress appropriating money to it, and that funding comes from offshore oil and gas revenue, actually.
And if we were doing the maintenance backlog, it would be, as we have proposed it so far in both House and Senate, it would be all forms of energy development.
All forms of energy, and there's a great growth, we think. For example, we had an offshore lease sale of $400 million.
So what amount of revenue does solar and wind proposals generate in relationship to oil and gas for both funding LWCF and potential for maintenance?
Oh, it could be very significant.
Okay. What are you doing to implement SB 47? That's one of the last things we actually did in a bipartisan, bicameral way.
So I feel great about that. We have put a team together. We gave the Assistant Secretary 60 days to come to us with an implementation plan. And I think that by the end of this month, we'll be implementing pretty much all the major provisions of that act in a very aggressive way. And one of those events was the one we went to last week.
And once again, I appreciate that, and that your presence was there as well. The last thing, and we'll get through this very quickly so people can get to vote. Fees are something I care about. Floria, I care about. Everyone else's eyes glaze over, but I care about it. You were very creative and legal in how you use fees during the shutdown, or how the department used fees during the shutdown. What kind of standards do you have in looking at how fees can be implemented, how we handle, how we deal with the maintenance, how we deal with the backlog as well?
So I think we have really areas where we can think through and improve the utilization of fees. For me, the reality is that using those fees to enhance the visitor's experience, ensuring that we have safe areas and amenities is really important, because that's where I think the future of funding for enhanced services comes from, and that is, I think the reality is Congress is only going to give us so much money, and so we really need to think about appropriate partnerships. We need to think about appropriate fee structures, and that is the future of the Park Service and maybe even BLM.
Are you still looking at Interior's commitment, though, to have the fees going back to the areas in which the fees
Absolutely,
are generated?
that's right. That the vast majority of that money stays in the park where that fee was collected. We have some super parks, but if it doesn't stay there, it completely undermines the purpose.
And I'll still lobby you for a 90-10 split rather than
Fair enough.
8-2.
Fair enough.
Mr. Lota?
Thank you, and I want to thank you, Mr. Secretary, for spending all this time. I'll try to really be brief. I just got your news release that said that the Department of Interior has renewed the 2 Twin Metals projects in Minnesota.
I don't think it's my news release, but it's a BLM release probably.
Yeah, it's under the Department of Interior, though, BLM, so I assume that you okayed this. In it, it says, to prevent public lands from being indefinitely encumbered by these leases with no benefit to the public, the terms placed upon the renewed leases include new diligent development requirements whereby the leasee is obligated to submit a complete proposed mine plan of operation, obtain all necessary permits, and meet certain project milestones for mine construction within a 10-year period, or these leases will be terminated. Pretty clear that you're into terminating. They got 10 years, and that's and that's really where you are. The reason we got into this was that the Solicitor General in 2017, Mr. Giorgiani, said the Obama administration had no right to cancel the boundary water leases. He said the historical record of the 1966 lease implications shows that production was not made a condition of renewal. That was real. They're 50 years old, those leases, but never entered into production. You know, the thing that's so strange is, and I'd like to enter into the record, the last news release that I have from Interior from 1966, which says that if this property is not brought into production within the initial 20-year term, it is terminated. So I feel like this is a bait and switch. This is a con job. You're saying, hey, we're not going to follow what happened before. Those leases should have been terminated, but we're going to put the same conditions in the new leases. This is very confusing. I do not understand this. Maybe you can kind of clarify how the leases weren't terminated after waiting 50 years, and yet now you put into it, if they're not done in 10 years, they will be terminated, when they're both conditions of the lease.
So I think this is obviously the third version of this lease. And I think that what you'll say, and I'm happy to make sure that they're appropriately provided, what you'll see is that they have real diligence provisions. We're not in the business of saying you can just sit on it and do nothing. And so we came up with some appropriate terms, I believe, that will ensure that they
So I understand that. I just have no time left. So you stand by Giorgiani's, the solicitor's, opinion that production was never part of the earlier lease?
Well, I certainly stand by the legality of the solicitor's opinion, and I think I think you'll find that this lease is legal as well.
Well, I think the decisions were made, you just wanted to do it there. You put this into it, that it's going to be done in 10 years, by ignoring what had happened before, I think. And so I'm just going to end, now that you've begun this process of turning out a news lease and putting forth, was the White House in putting forth that the leases will be renewed, was the White House part of this decision-making?
You mean in terms of the decision itself?
Yeah, now you've just started this, you're renewing leases.
This is a Department of the Interior decision.
So the White House was not involved?
No.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And, Mr. Secretary, thank you for your indulgence. Thank you for being here and part of the meeting. There are consequential issues that this committee has in its jurisdiction, consequential. And as I said earlier in my comments, that the differences that we have to do with direction and policy that you're carrying out within that department. I think that was obvious in some particular areas. We have a responsibility to do our due diligence to try to convince you or the American public that we should be going in a different direction. And there are areas that are special in this country that should be left alone and not extracted from. And that's just one example. And as we go forward, I hope that the candor and the frankness that we had at our meeting and that you shared with this committee today continues, because difficult choices also require, differences in direction require this committee and the majority to seek as assertively as we can the motivation behind policy changes and direction, and more importantly, for the oversight function and our constitutional responsibility, the rationale. So going forward, thank you again. Meeting adjourned.